This is Audible.
Tadeusz Kosciuszko and Casimir Pulaski, The Lives of the Revolutionary War's Most Famous Polish Officers. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Ken Touche.
Early years. Pulaski's date and place of birth are sources of contention among historians. The generally accepted birthday has been March 6, 1745, although Polish-American historian Edward Pinkowski claims to have discovered the true date as March 4, 1747. Eventually, the date of March 6th was confirmed independently by two researchers, Wladyslaw Rudzinski and Reverend Stanislaw Makarowicz, and four matching baptismal records bear that date. Makarowicz was the pastor of St. Stephen's Roman Catholic Church in Radom. Witnesses of Pulaski's baptism include Stanislaw Poniatowski, the father of the future King of Poland, Prince August Czartoryski, and Prince Friedrich Michal Czartoryski, from the most powerful family in Poland. Casimir Rudzinski, the Castellan of Czech, also witnessed the event and attested that the baptismal certificate was written at the time of the ceremony. Locating Pulaski's place of birth is more difficult, and the issue remains filled with uncertainties and controversies. One account suggests that he was born in the Polish town of Warka, situated on the left bank of the Pilika River. The area in which his birth occurred is further narrowed to the neighborhood of Viniari, where he is said to have spent the bulk of his childhood. Others claim that Pulaski was born in Podolia, a region occupying part of modern-day Ukraine. Still more set the location in Warsaw, at the manor house of the Pulaski family, and a separate claim is made for the region of Maziowa, a historic area of northeastern Poland. Despite the numerous theories, documents for Pulaski's baptism at St. Nicholas Church in Warka strongly support the claim for that location. A parallel account states that Father Krzysztof Faltz of St. Nicholas was summoned to the Pulaski residence on the corner of Nowy Swiat and Wareka streets because the child suffered from an unknown debilitation. Once he recovered, the baptism was completed at the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw. Regardless of where and when he was born, as was customary, Pulaski received the formal education of an aristocrat, which was overseen by his mother, Mariana Pulaski, of the Zielinska family. No matter what the boy's interests or future vocation might be, at least a minimal familiarity with a variety of subjects was necessary for navigating high society. Meanwhile, the more central career-oriented education was organized and carried out by his father, noted jurist Józef Pulaski. The Polish Crown Tribunal, with two central venues within the country, was the highest appeals court in the land, and the elder Pulaski served as an advocatus. This medieval term originally signified a lawyer in charge of the secular issues of an abbey. In this spirit, Pulaski's son was reared for the bar, and as part of that regimen, the younger Pulaski spent much of his adolescence in a Warsaw college operated by the Theatines. The male order of the Roman Catholic Church was founded by Gaetano de Conti di Tiene, and a group of fellow Catholic men, including Pietro Carafa, later Pope Paul IV. The strong Roman underpinnings of Polish society exacerbated its lengthy national conflict with Russia, which was steeped in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. With the Theatines, Pulaski endured a severe rule of life that would serve him well in a stark military existence. Long-standing conditions of war between European states were protracted affairs. Some spanned centuries in duration, with regular outbreaks and interspersed periods of calm. Many of these states shared borders that changed by the month through battles won and lost, and the conflicts were often rooted in claims dating hundreds of years in the past. International law was all but non-existent, and attacking a neighbor based on one's odds of success were sufficient grounds for military action. Fortunately, Poland's relationship with the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires was stable enough for a national coexistence, however uneasy. But the most pressing danger was Russia and its habitual craving for geographic expansion. It was upon Russia's domination of the region that the Polish independence movement and Pulaski's life ambitions were built. Demonstrating little to no interest in any other matter, personal or national, his life purpose and greatest joy was to fight against the Russians. Pulaski's personal passion for independence was forged in his family 2 centuries prior, at the establishment of a Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth. John III Sobieski, the elective king of Poland, had driven back the Turks, thus preserving integrity of his former borders, and for a time bringing Lithuania to prominence as well, with a strong alliance. Fearing Muscovite expansion, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was enacted by the Treaty of Lublin in the mid-16th century. To coexist with such large neighboring empires, the necessity of such a union was clear, and the region emerged as a single sovereign entity with a shared monarch. As one of Europe's most powerful states, the Commonwealth maintained a significant military presence, with which to hold Russia at bay through the mid-17th century. However, a gradual collapse began with the Russo-Polish War that broke out in the 1650s, also known as the 13 Years' War. Although the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth won its share of the battles, Lithuania's economy all but collapsed, creating a heavy burden on the prosperity and military readiness of the broader state. Sensing this, the subsequent Russian government of Peter the Great reclaimed a sizable percentage of Lithuanian lands and retook them in a joint effort with Sweden's King Charles. The attack against an already strained economic structure devastated the region and its thoroughly Roman non-Russian population. In total, half of the Polish-Lithuanian population was wiped out in the latter portion of the 17th century. Barely 2 decades before Casimir Pulaski's birth, and in the ascendancy of his father Józef's powers, the Dresden-born Augustus III, Elector of Saxony, was crowned king in Krakow, joining the Roman Church and marrying Maria Josepha of the Holy Roman Empire. During this reign of disorder, in which Augustus seemed more interested in ease and pleasure, administration of government and the military was turned over to the powerful Lithuanian Czartoryski family. So powerful was this noble house in Poland that they were simply referred to as the family. Supporting the Habsburg structure in Europe, Augustus upheld Russia's claim to the kingdom of Courland, where the younger Pulaski would spend his formative years. In addition, the king willingly gave way to interventions by the Empress Catherine. Such realities in Poland and Lithuania set the Pulaski family on a single-minded course to join in the fight for independence. In addition to his fame in the courts, Józef Pulaski also served as starost of Warka. The term implies the office of a quasi-official leader or elder, entrusted with the overseeing of a specific locale. The region's population accepted his status with great seriousness, and considering the constant state of strife with Russian overlords, both of his positions were actively linked to the resistance, whether secret or overt. National politics caught his son's fascination at an early age, and the central credo of Polish aristocratic politics in the 18th century was bent toward resisting Russia. The Polish military. In 1760, with Casimir having reached 15 years of age, father and son joined with other noble families to raise the intensity of anti-Russian fervor. As the dialogue turned to military action, complete with nearly suicidal displays of passionate patriotism, the time came for Casimir to train for a commission as an officer in the Polish forces, an opportunity available only to those of aristocratic breeding. Józef Pulaski was in an ideal position to provide the highest social and military connections for his son. Installing him in the company of Count Karl Charles Joseph of Saxony, Duke of Courland, in 1762, Casimir spent formative years as a page in the Duke's household at Michal, or Mitava. Courland was associated with Semigalen as well, a geographic entity situated in the Baltics, and part of the Lithuanian Commonwealth. In Michal, Pulaski was free to develop his passionate anti-Russian imagination into a personal transformation that recreated him as an astute military figure. Only one restriction weighed on his ardor. The entire household was required to maintain a low profile. Even the highest-born families in Poland were, at the time, kept captive by the occupying Russians, who ruled the region, and no overt countermove could be directed against the occupiers until forces were gathered and trained in greater numbers. In addition to Courland, Pulaski shared a crest with the Schlepovran family. Through the influences of his environment and introductions to wealthy houses, he was able to learn a smattering of languages, enjoy the graces of the Czartoryski, absorb their national policies, and maneuver in the social strata of Stanislav Poniatowski, their brother-in-law. Poniatowski would in time become King of Poland. That same year, Pulaski had his first combat experience serving under Prince Charles and defending the Michal, the capital of Courland itself, from a siege laid by the Russian army. Courland was preserved and would not be annexed by the Russian Empire for 3 more decades. In 1763, Augustus III died and was replaced by Stanislaus August Poniatowski. Barely past the age of 30, Poniatowski's ascendancy had been set from the time of his birth. His mother, the Princess Constantia, appeared in St. Petersburg with her substantial army to seek the Empress Catherine's assistance in overthrowing Augustus. Employing her considerable troops and influences, the Empress was only too happy to make certain that Poniatowski was installed, the two being former lovers well before her ascension to the Russian throne. As a sovereign, she forbade any action against the legal government structure of Poland while Augustus was still alive, but she subsequently supported Poniatowski generously. The new king was restrained by Catherine on the sole condition that he refrain from ever coming to St. Petersburg, regardless of the reason. The leanings of royal figures in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth bore substantial importance, but in the Commonwealth their day-to-day agendas could be softened, postponed, or even eliminated through aristocratic resistance in the diplomatic arena. Thus, the succession of kings in the 17th and 18th centuries were, for the most part, held in check by the major houses, which acted by paralyzing executive action. All legislative actions affecting the larger state required unanimity, and a single voice could bring a halt to the proceedings through the use of a liberum veto, both useful and vexing in a judiciary riddled with corruption. With such counterbalances available, the election of Stanislav to the throne was for the time acceptable. A few among the aristocracy even displayed guarded optimism that he would allow the Commonwealth to go along in its own way. By 1764, Pulaski had attained the title of Starost of Zelulinci through his father's efforts, and during this period he lent general support to Poniatowski's reign despite his ties to Catherine. However, over the following 3 years it became clear to aristocrats of the Commonwealth that the king was unable or unwilling to curb Russian influence, and the growing perception of Poniatowski as a Russian puppet led to the emergence of an organized resistance, with support coming from legislative, judicial, and military luminaries throughout the Commonwealth. This group included Joseph Pulaski, and, through association, his son as well. Known as the Bar Confederation, aristocratic Poland's conceptual resistance to Russia soon crossed the line into armed rebellion. Within the year, Casimir was given the rank of pułkownik, the equivalent of a colonel for a Polish cavalry officer, and as such he was made a choragiew. The term began as the 14th-century Polish designation for the commander of a large cavalry unit, able to act either in support of foot soldiers or to move independently. Lengthy campaigns signaled the beginning of the resistance, not as a series of battles, but as an intense recruiting period of agitating within the Polish military. The widespread Polish units were ripening for such an appeal, and the initial efforts yielded a fair number of converts. Pulaski was already well versed in such exhortations to action. Before the young Empress of Russia installed her former lover as regent of Poland, Pulaski had already raised a small force called the Knights of the Holy Cross. Their distinctive uniforms featured a field of crimson on the right side of each man and a Tartar cap. In the first battles initiated by the Bar Confederation, the young Pulaski fared well, despite having little battlefield experience. His first victory took place on April 20th, 1764, near Pohorelek, presently situated in Belarus, near the border with Ukraine. A second victory came on April 23rd in Starokostianyev, now in northern Ukraine. Pulaski's first defeat occurred 2 days later, in Kasanovka. Such battles were fought with great frequency throughout the era of the struggle for Polish independence, and victory and defeat were normally categorized in statistical terms, such as by forces killed or wounded, and ground taken or surrendered. A foreign onlooker cannot assume from the occurrence of defeats that armies were annihilated or removed from functionality in a series of battles, most often fought in the vicinity of small towns and holy sites. The ebb and flow continued unceasingly through the Confederation's existence as a militarized unit. An exception to the norm occurred in early May, when Pulaski was forced to retreat from Khmelnyk, where he had prepared for a lengthy defense against a siege. Falling back to the monastery at Berdysov, Pulaski expertly defended the site against royal forces in league with the Russian army for 2 weeks, despite his slender forces. The siege ended on June 16th, at which time Pulaski was forced to surrender and was taken captive. A military observer of the time might have supposed that this spelled the end of Pulaski's participation in the war, assuming he was allowed to live at all. However, the Russians released him from captivity soon after, exacting from him a signed pledge to forswear his allegiance to the Confederation and reject any call to take up arms against the prevailing Russian order again. The Russians further ordered that any contact with the Confederation must be spent exhorting them to suspend all hostilities. When Pulaski returned to the Confederation, he declared that his coerced assent to the pledge was non-binding, thereby renewing his devotion to the Polish cause. Nonetheless, his return to the Confederation was met with widespread hostility, even within his own family. Having signed the pledge, his reputation was severely weakened. Some among the Confederates addressed him with the stigma of a weakling or spy, and continuing debates grew heated over his fate at the bar. At one point, his father considered court-martialing him, and the tempest did not subside for another 2 years. Despite the furor in the intervening months of 1768, neither Joseph nor Casimir remained idle in the cause. In February, the father and all 3 of his sons departed Warsaw to recruit along the Dniester River in preparation for a Confederation gathering in Ukraine's Lvov, establishing the Confederation in Podole and occupying parts of present-day Ukraine and Moldavia. Despite ongoing contention within the Confederation and the younger Pulaski's place in the family, he was given a commander's position and served directly under his father, by this time known as the Marshal of the Union. Casimir shared the 3-way command with his 2 brothers, each leading separate units. The Pulaski family forces were forced to retreat once more into Moldavia by early summer, and Casimir was again taken captive by the Russians, who took the town of Bar on June 20th. With his forces scattered, Joseph crossed into Ottoman territory in order to seek refuge. Needless to say, after Casimir was captured again, imprisonment or execution was anticipated. But he was miraculously released yet again a second time, on July 17th, with his captors either unaware or dismissive of the fact that he had broken his pledge to refuse taking up arms again. Pulaski did not tarry to question the decision, instead hastening to the town of Khotin for a meeting with fellow factions of the Confederation. Khotin was a centerpiece in the Ottoman invasion of Moldavia and neighboring lands from the past century, at which time a Polish-Turkish alliance had been proposed but never established. Along the route, in partnership with his brothers, Pulaski carried out numerous raids along the Dniester River. However, the once sympathetic Ottomans were not the friends for which the Pulaski family hoped, and Joseph was arrested in December of 1768 for what were described as intrigues within his Confederate camp. For over a year, the Polish leadership had all but washed their hands of Poniatowski. The dissatisfaction stemmed from his inability or unwillingness to resist Russia in any fashion. Despite his intimate ties to Catherine, the powerful houses had hoped for at least a stable status quo. The following February, Casimir conducted a raid in the vicinity of Zalesiki and another near Tlusty, both in northern Ukraine. During these skirmishes he received a notification from Confederates of western Little Poland, known as Malopolska, with instructions to join them in all haste. By March he was marching toward Krakow. On April 3, 1769, Joseph Pulaski died in a Turkish prison from an unnamed epidemic. For his family, life went on with little time to grieve, as all three brothers were leading units far from home. While Pulaski's two siblings were unsuccessful in an attempt to take Lvov, Casimir faced superior forces at the old fortress of Okopy, his base of operations in the Tarnopol region of western Ukraine. In a brilliant display of tactical strategy, he broke through the Russian siege on April 7th and was acclaimed as the regimentars, or governor, of the Krakow voivodeship. During the following 2 months, he operated near Przemysl, but despite his best efforts, he failed to take the town. For this he endured much criticism from his fellow Confederates. By June 3rd, Pulaski was on the march again, heading into Lithuania with a number of allies and a force of 600. His campaign was an attempt to incite a larger revolt against the Russians, and despite lacking major victories in his brief career, his talent for recruitment drew almost 4,000 men to the Confederation, a force which he was able to guide safely to the Bar's staging point, where they could be best utilized. While moving toward Zamość, his reputation blossomed, despite a defeat at the Battle of Wladyslaw on September 15th. So damaged was the structure of his force that the remainder of the year was taken up with rebuilding the unit in the Subcarpathian province. With a refreshed force, Pulaski moved toward Novi Targ and assisted in the suppression of a local leader's mutiny. Based in Izby, Pulaski moved through the region of southern Lesser Poland. There he experienced another setback at the Battle of Deborzin on June 9th. Shortly after, he was able to confer with other members of the Confederate leadership. This gathering included an appearance by Joseph II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who was complimentary of Pulaski's performance in the field. Less than a month later, Pulaski's camp was captured by the German-born General Johann von Drewitz. This forced Pulaski to retreat into Austrian territory, accomplished with little time to spare. In August he met Charles-François Dumouriez, a French general who would go on to achieve fame in the French Revolution, and later traitorously defect to the Austrians. Dumouriez soon learned, at the cause's expense, that Pulaski's habitual tendency was to follow his own path, often changing plans in the midst of carefully coordinated missions. In the summer of 1769 he disregarded an order to take the town of Lankorona, and instead joined forces with Michal Walewski in a raid on Krakow. At the end of 1769, Pulaski executed brilliant marches throughout Poland and Lithuania, raising support for a revolution in every section of the country. In a mad rush to reach safety in the Carpathian Mountains, he suffered defeats against General Suvorov at Komazy, near Wladow, reaching the mountains with a party of only 10 in a long, tortuous journey. However, once he reached the protection of the Carpathians and swelled his ranks again, he carried out forays into Poland. The winter of 1769 to 1770 was spent at Lomacy. On the night of August 31st, 1770, Walewski and Pulaski departed for Czechoslovakia, taking over the Jasna Gora monastery on September 10th. Such a move was significant, as the monastery was considered one of the holiest sites in the Commonwealth. Situated in the city, the grounds housed a shrine to the Virgin Mary, featuring one of the world's most famous Black Madonna statues. The statue was able to exude magical powers, according to the local faithful. During his defense of the monastery, Pulaski met with Franciszka Krasinskich, a member of one of Poland's most important families. A high aristocrat from the Krasinski family, she was the wife of Charles of Saxony, Duke of Courland, and she would become one of Pulaski's most important protectors. Fortifying the shrine, Pulaski's defense staved off a full attack by General Drewitz on January 9, 1771. On January 14th, the siege collapsed, and Pulaski joined with compatriots to force Drewitz's withdrawal, driving him beyond the Vistula, Poland's largest river. Pulaski's defense of the monastery was accomplished with a detail numbering no more than a mere 200 soldiers, which amply demonstrated Pulaski's mastery of tactics. Hallmarks of his ability to face superior numbers included advantageous use of the existing terrain, holding the momentum, and harassing enemy ranks without ever offering a full battle. Even with lesser numbers, It was Pulaski's intent to follow Drewitz and annihilate his forces, but orders from a superior command prevented further pursuit. In February 1771, Pulaski was again on the march, winning a victory at Tarlov and laying siege to Krasnik. That same month he became a member of the Confederate War Council. General Charles-François Dumouriez, a military adviser, offered some brief descriptions of Pulaski that were not altogether positive, and at times he found himself bemused by the young commander's personality. He called Pulaski spontaneous, more proud than ambitious, short and thin, pacing, speaking quickly, not interested in women or drink, enjoyed fighting the Russians above all else. Of course, Dumouriez's mixed opinion did not impede Pulaski's progress. In the spring, he advanced on Zamosk, and after again disregarding orders from Dumouriez, he was defeated at Lancorona. A victory at the Battle of Madjani did little to soften the Confederation's displeasure toward his previous insubordination, and he swore to his superiors that he would faithfully adhere to orders in the future. However, during this time an action was taken against Poniatowski that would eventually lead to Pulaski's exile and arrival in the American colonies. A plot between members of the Confederation was acted out when Stanislav Augustus II was kidnapped by aristocrats dressed as peasants. Although Pulaski was not present, the conspirators were on their way to him with the king as hostage, but the abductors lost heart along the way and eventually crumbled, restoring Stanislav. The Confederation was severely weakened, and once identified as a conspirator in absentia, Pulaski was expelled from Austrian territory, where he might have found safety a short time before. Despite this, for the remainder of the year he once more defended Jasna against Drewitz and the Polish army, under the ultimate command of Branicki. Kosciuszko's early years. The birth date of Tadeusz Andrzej Bonaventura Kosciuszko, like that of many historical figures from the 18th century, is an item of debate. The most widely accepted one is February 4th, 1746, although some claim it was February 2nd. The latter is considered a fanciful effort to attach Kosciuszko to Abraham Lincoln's birthday in the modern age. The location of his birth, the town of Merecovshchezna, now part of modern Belarus, enjoys more widespread agreement. Kosciuszko's paternal family was Lithuanian and Ruthenian by ethnicity, the latter term signifying the region of Belarus. Other sources claim the birthplace as being near the town of Kos. The male lineage was traceable back to King Sigismund I, the Old, a monarch of the mid-15th century, and in the spirit of Kosciuszko, a legendary patron of the arts. The derivation of Kosciuszko's Christian name is the Slavic word for blackbird. The region of his youth, which came to be known as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was predominantly Roman Catholic, but surrounded by the Russian adherents to the Greek Orthodox Church. Kosciuszko was the youngest son of a szlachcic, or nobleman, titled as the sword-bearer of the Palatinate of Brześć, capital of the Brest region. The family sported the Polish Roch coat of arms. Kosciuszko's mother, Tekla, was of the Ratomska family. Despite the family's geographical association with Belarus, members virtually never overtly celebrated or even spoke of it. The Kosciuszko holdings were of a modest nature, and the estate was worked by 31 families. Kosciuszko began his academic quest closer to home at Lubishov in 1755, but he was forced to suspend studies in 1758 upon the death of his father, sending the family into dire financial straits. In the early years, at the Piarist College, he was a pupil of the Roman Church's oldest educational order. Here Kosciuszko studied Polish and world history, philosophy, Latin, German, French, and law. Soon he added studies in geography, geometry, and engineering. In 1765, Stanislav Poniatowski, King of Poland, founded the Corps of Cadets in Warsaw, dedicated to the development of Polish military officers. The Corps would in time evolve into Warsaw University. As he did with every such opportunity, Kosciuszko excelled there as a young adult. Attracting special attention from Poniatowski, Kosciuszko was sent to Western Europe for study. During this period, the Bar Confederation emerged, a group of Poland's most prestigious houses bent on resisting Russian influences on Polish liberty and attacks against the Roman Church. The once powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was reclaimed by Russia, and many of the young nobles became officers in both the resistance and the Polish army, in service of the king. Kosciuszko was to miss this chapter in the fight for Polish independence. However, not yet having received the vastly diverse education he was offered in Europe, he would likely have been unprepared for such a movement. Under Poniatowski's sponsorship, Kosciuszko studied military and civil architecture in Paris, but soon expanded his academic work in several directions, including studying art at the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. During the Paris period, he even enjoyed a romantic reputation as a musician. At first, his primary aspirations centered not only on civil engineering, but on internalizing the strategies of Sébastien Leprest de Bobin, Europe's foremost authority on forts and sieges. Beginning in 1768, the year in which he obtained a captaincy from Prince Adam Casimir Czartoryski, Kosciuszko spent a 5-year period auditing every lecture presented at the libraries of Paris military academies, and his regimen included the study of physiocracy, the preeminent French economic theory. Before returning to Poland, he studied in Germany and Italy as well, finishing his work on fortifications and naval tactics at Brest in Belarus. What Kosciuszko himself likely did not realize is that through the works of Rousseau and Voltaire, his social view was swinging far toward the sentiments of universal personal liberty. He delved into the ancient Greeks for clarity on the individual as a member of the state, but found his personal social niche in the writings of John Locke. Even though such philosophical studies cemented later friendships with Enlightenment proponents such as Thomas Jefferson, it was the plight of Poland that triggered his urge to act. He returned to his home country in 1774, prepared to serve as a commissioned officer. Revolutionary. The newly educated young nobleman suffered disappointment on several fronts upon his return. To his astonishment, Poland had no need of his services, as the army was drastically reduced in numbers due in large part to the failed rebellion of the Bar Confederation. The nation suffered the first partition 2 years prior, and Polish independent forces were held firmly in check by Russian overseers. Kosciuszko took a tutoring position with the prestigious family of General Józef Sosnowski. There he taught 4 daughters in mathematics and drawing, but he committed the misstep of falling in love with the eldest, Ludwika, who reciprocated his feelings. Kosciuszko and his pupil attempted to elope without success. Before escaping the Sosnowski estate, he was beaten severely by the general's retainers, and he decided to flee the country for France, in fear of the family's further wrath. The physical abuse forever altered Kosciuszko's view of social hierarchy and class distinctions in general. Further disappointment confronted him upon learning that his brother had squandered the family fortune while he was away. He had intended to employ the funds in buying a military officer's commission, the standard practice for noblemen entering military service. Borrowing money from his brother-in-law and leaving Poland for the second time, Kosciuszko stopped in Dresden, a city known for its moniker, the German Florence. In 1775 he made application to the Saxon army, but was rejected. Proceeding to Paris, he made the acquaintance of Charles Noël François Roman de Lille, a like-minded artillery captain. In de Lille's company, Kosciuszko became increasingly aware of the interest taken by European military men in the budding urge for independence among the American colonies. The looming British-American strife was a leading topic of conversation among the European intellectual class, and aspiring or exiled officers felt the pull of glorious employment and in many ways fulfillment of personal idealism. Destiny was forever altered for Kosciuszko after meeting a series of dignitaries in Paris. The most compelling conversation he had was with America's envoy to France, Benjamin Franklin. That Kosciuszko met Franklin at all was unusual, as he had no letters of introduction from any prestigious person or institution on either continent. Once granted an audience, he requested instead to be tested with an advanced exam in both engineering and military architecture in lieu of such credentials. In response, Franklin revealed the dire need for engineers in America by asking incredulously, "Who would proctor such an exam?" Kosciuszko was indeed tested in advanced geometry, scoring an impressive mark. However, the ensuing conversation with Franklin is what likely set his introduction to the North American continent in motion. By June of 1776, 1 month before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, he boarded a ship with de Lisle and other European military officers bound for Philadelphia. Generally accepted by most historians that the ship traveled by way of Santo Domingo, Kosciuszko's journey was an arduous one. More than one biographer has entertained the notion that the vessel was wrecked traveling through the West Indies, but such an account is unlikely considering his travel time and arrival within 2 months. Kosciuszko's dream of serving General Washington was impeded upon arrival, as much had changed since the Declaration's signing. The city of New York had fallen to the British, and Philadelphia was menaced. Fellow Polish officers were sent their separate ways, and de Lisle was almost immediately commissioned as a major in the artillery. With Kosciuszko's broad knowledge, some uncertainty persisted as to his most suitable role. Nevertheless, at 30 years of age, he strode into Philadelphia's Independence Hall on August 30th, 1776, with a stellar letter of recommendation from Franklin and an exceedingly high mark on a geometry exam. Armed with these, he introduced himself personally to the Continental Congress, causing one member to remark that the young Pole was of unassuming manners and grave temper. A typical response to a first meeting with Kosciuszko suggested that he was in some manner Byronic. He was immediately assigned to the U.S. War Department in the hope that they would know what to do with him. Ironically, he spent many of his early days in volunteer employment with Franklin. Residing in Philadelphia for a time, his first engineering assignment was to construct defenses for the city's waterfront at Fort Mercer. In tandem, he fortified Fort Billingsport and produced designs to protect the banks of the Delaware River, the clearest route for an invasion by sea. In one example of daring as an engineer, Kosciuszko installed palisades in the Delaware, forcing British ships into virtual canals from which they could be easily bombarded. Kosciuszko's redoubts at Fort Putnam provided defenders with a sweeping view of the river, allowing artillery to deliver a hail of fire onto approaching craft. News of such innovative defenses reached the ears of Congress in short order, and John Hancock promoted him to the rank of Colonel of Engineers. Soon after, Congress transferred Kosciuszko to the Pennsylvania Committee of Defense, where he participated in the planning and design of defenses protecting the congressional residence. The salary for a Colonel of Engineers reached $60 per month, excellent wages by modern standards. His arrival coincided with a pressing need for such designers. It was in his early days in Pennsylvania that Kosciuszko first read Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Reportedly, he was so moved that meeting the document's author became one of his life's highest priorities. As an international student of government and culture, Kosciuszko likely understood the American cause with more depth than the average citizen. Jefferson was, for Kosciuszko, the perfect spokesman for the ideals of Locke in the New World, and once introduced, they corresponded for over 2 decades. Ironically, the one individual in the Continental Army who was slow in coming to appreciate Kosciuszko was General Washington himself. Occupied by many burdens in his leadership of the war effort, Washington was astonished even to discover that Kosciuszko was Polish, not French, as the general had imagined. Kosciuszko was transferred to a project aimed at bolstering the defenses of Fort Ticonderoga in 1777. The fort, built by the French near the southern end of Lake Champlain in northern New York, posed some logistical challenges, and a few others had wrestled with various plans, including one by fellow painter John Turnbull. Ticonderoga fell into American hands at the war's onset, and the leadership believed that it was all but invulnerable to attack in its natural condition. Britain attempted an invasion from Canada in the prior year, only to be stopped on Lake Champlain by Benedict Arnold. Kosciuszko was initially brought to Ticonderoga as one of several advisers. Despite General Horatio Gates's knowledge of his gifts as a skilled engineer with a military education, Kosciuszko was expected to serve, not supersede. As Kosciuszko studied the various sketches left for him by earlier engineers, one important omission struck him in every case. The nearby mountain, officially dubbed Mount Defiance and affectionately called Sugarloaf, stood at almost 800 feet tall. It loomed over the entire area at a superior height, including the fort and the boat bridge. Steep and pointed, the summit represented a clear opportunity for attack by artillery stationed on the mountaintop. Kosciuszko was assigned to General Gates's command and set about neutralizing the problem. Unfortunately, Gates was transferred to Saratoga, and his replacement was General Arthur St. Clair. As he had with Gates, Kosciuszko recommended to St. Clair and his superior officer, General Schuyler, that the mountain be fortified, to deny such an opportunity to the British. Schuyler rejected the notion outright, as none of the other engineers had ever mentioned it, and he passed along his decision to St. Clair. Ever mindful of his military code of decorum, Kosciuszko's urge to argue his case left him timidly honest, and he obediently gave way. St. Clair believed that no invasion was imminent until it was already upon him. Learning of Burgoyne's approach, he continued to believe that the British would march toward Philadelphia, and thus he left Ticonderoga vulnerable. Intelligence gathering was inhibited by Indians in the region interfering with scouts, and the error did not take long to victimize the fort. On June 30th, 1777, General Burgoyne arrived with a sizable force, prepared to take Ticonderoga, and only days after Kosciuszko's warning, the British could be seen hauling large artillery to the top of Mount Defiance, revealing Schuyler's mistake in rejecting the engineer's proposal. St. Clair understood that his career would be finished if he surrendered, and that fighting was his only option. However, the British settled in for a siege. On July 4th, the Americans held a quiet celebration, but Indian fires lit upon Mount Defiance gave away the advantage of surprise. Remaining in Ticonderoga became untenable, and the fort was quickly abandoned. St. Clair left a garrison of 1,000 to handle supplies at the fort, with the intent of having them rejoin the main body. Instead, the British found them drunk and asleep, and took the fort without firing a shot. Not only was the Lake Champlain route compromised, but the way was left open for Burgoyne to advance on Albany and General Gates's position. Not satisfied with taking Ticonderoga, Burgoyne sensed an opportunity to pursue and rout the fleeing Americans as they attempted to make a rapid escape by boat and land. The pursuit was foiled in part by the resourcefulness of Kosciuszko, in charge of defending the rear of the retreat. He accomplished this by felling trees and repositioning boulders to block the trails. By diverting and damming the streams, the region's woodlands became a swamp through which the British were forced to travel at a snail's pace. Ultimately, nearly all of the fort's personnel reached safety. Schuyler and St. Clair were both removed by Gates, according to Washington's wishes, although both were later exonerated. St. Clair went so far as to request a court-martial in which he could fully explain his actions. Much of Kosciuszko's time in July was spent fortifying defenses along the Hudson River, but Burgoyne progressed toward an inevitable showdown with Gates that finally occurred between September 19th and October 17th. The confrontation between the two forces, the Battle of Saratoga, would be a turning point in the war that finally persuaded the French to establish an alliance with the Americans. Following Burgoyne's failure to subdue the retreating Americans, he moved to the banks of the Hudson to meet with a separate force under General Howe. Crossing the Hudson to encamp near Saratoga, he was initially unaware that Gates was camped only 4 miles away. Burgoyne's force was shrinking in numbers, and supplies were slow to move along the route from their origin in Canada. Gates's numbers, on the other hand, were increasing. They eventually reached 20,000, and resources for the Americans were available from a much shorter distance away. Kosciuszko was assigned the task of surveying every plot of land between Saratoga and Stillwater. Further instructions ordered him to design and build defenses immediately on the ground of his own choosing. The site selected was known as Bemis Heights, overlooking the Hudson and situated 3 miles north of the Mohawk River. Within a period of 7 days, Kosciuszko altered the earthworks and positioned heavy weaponry into a strong array of defenses nearly impregnable from any direction. Burgoyne's first attack was launched on September 19th in what has been called the Battle of Bemis Heights, or the Battle of Freeman's Farm. At first, Burgoyne was unable to determine the whereabouts of the American positions at all. Scouting parties reported no sign of the enemy, and even after Gates's location was finally pinpointed, Burgoyne failed to even reach the American lines before being repulsed. Studying Kosciuszko's fortifications at a distance, no solution seemed credible for assaulting the Bemis Heights. High-ranking officers recommended a retreat to Canada, but Burgoyne was waiting for reinforcements from Howe that would never come. In the second assault of October 17th, Kosciuszko's defenses proved similarly unapproachable. Trying an alternate tactic, Burgoyne attacked around the edge of the heights through a densely wooded area. There, Virginia sharpshooters, under the command of Benedict Arnold and his captain Daniel Morgan, inflicted serious casualties on British regulars, causing a second retreat. Burgoyne's eventual decision to withdraw from the Hudson was made too late, and the entire British contingent of 8,000 was boxed in and forced to surrender. With their surrender, British plans to divide New England were lost, and French confidence in the American Revolution rose. King Louis XVI took the step of joining in an alliance with the rebels, offering naval support and supplies. Across the Atlantic, war was declared on Britain. News of the surrender spread like wildfire, and Kosciuszko was elevated to a high status within the Continental Army, along with General Gates. General Washington began to gain confidence in Kosciuszko and came to think of him as his personal secret weapon. Soon after Saratoga, Kosciuszko was reassigned to fortify what Washington called the key to America, West Point. The home of the future military academy of the U.S. Army was tasked with protecting the Hudson and the northern portion of the states by ruling the river. Offers of promotion to high rank for Kosciuszko were offered almost immediately following the victory at Saratoga, but he declined in each instance. Content with his present work, he declared to prefer peace more than the greatest rank in the world. This disinclination toward advancement remained constant throughout the war. West Point was a prized possession of the Continental Army. By the time Kosciuszko arrived, it was at best a barely inhabitable wilderness, but in the right hands it displayed the best features for a potential fortress. With events accelerating in the north and Washington intent on recapturing the region, Kosciuszko was given the chief direction and superintendence over the most important post in America. The facilities of West Point were in fact largely realized on Kosciuszko's recommendation. As his fame rose, the first manual on mobile artillery was published based on an early treatise he had penned on the subject. West Point was not to be a hasty project for an upcoming battle, and Kosciuszko took the following 2 years to complete his project. 2 French engineers had begun the work, with some controversy. Brigadier General Duportail was later to design the defenses at Yorktown, the site of Cornwallis's surrender. Cartographer Jean-Louis Ambroise de Genton-Villefranche created the most up-to-date map of the broader Hudson River, including its most important defensive sites. Kosciuszko became immediately aware that the barely begun construction process was already in a confused state, and that both manpower and supplies were erratic in their availability. Work was slow, as the terrain was steep and rocky, and he was staffed with too few and poorly clothed men. Kosciuszko's initial report sent to Washington indicated an unusual litany of requests, including masons, time, teams, and rum. The latter proved to be an invaluable asset, as 20 of the carpenters were all but incapacitated from drinking nearby land water. At one point, weary of the seemingly endless task, Kosciuszko requested a transfer, but he thought better of it soon after. Once the worker and supply situation became more regulated, the regimen of building West Point's fortifications began to improve rapidly. Once the first ramparts were complete, military experts who visited declared it to be almost impregnable. Among Kosciuszko's designs that worked their way into reality was one of such epic nature as to cause astonishment among military engineers around the world. Despite its initial appearance of pure fantasy, Kosciuszko ordered a prodigious and heavy iron chain to be constructed and pulled across the Hudson, to be moored on the opposite shore. Historically, the chain boom served as a method of controlling or blocking navigable waters. Under Kosciuszko, 2 lengths of massive chain were constructed, together weighing 60 tons and made of locally forged iron. 2 chevaux de frise were constructed in tandem. Originally an anti-cavalry tactic, this structure served merely as an obstruction. At times, a simple log from which spikes or other projectiles protruded was sufficient. The first such defensive weapon used in the Hudson during the war was designed by Robert Erskine, and Benjamin Franklin had once toyed with the tactic as an inventor. However, Kosciuszko's grand version of the artifact outgrew all historical proportions and afforded him additional strategic options. The chain required hoisting during the winter to avoid having it freeze below the surface. It was again lowered in the spring. Should any British ship work its way up the Hudson as far as West Point, the chain was to be pulled up taut, preventing the vessel's retreat, and from the heights of the shore artillery could bombard them at will. With so many of the enemy's options eliminated by Kosciuszko's designs, the British decided that an attack on West Point from any direction was unthinkable. Even a secret offer from Benedict Arnold to sell Kosciuszko's plans to the British did not convince the enemy to mount an effort. All British forces withdrew from the area, and West Point, called the American Gibraltar by friend and foe alike, became one of the most stable and secure assets of the war. Kosciuszko increased the peril in attacking West Point even further by fortifying Pebbles Island, situated at the confluence of the Hudson and Mohawk a few miles to the south. From beginning of the work at West Point, Kosciuszko remained averse to forming lasting associations. However, numerous parties were held, born out of a new mood created by the French alliance. Kosciuszko even composed a polonaise for the harpsichord, to the lyrics of Reinhold Tucholsky, a piece that would gain great popularity in Poland during the great uprising to come. He socialized on a regular basis and was said to possess high spirits and an engaging personality and a puckish sense of humor. As the son of a nobleman, he was trained to be a delightful conversationalist in the presence of ladies, and made the social rounds with a soft and conciliating panache. Colleagues described his non-working hours as gregarious and flirtatious. During times of solitude, Kosciuszko took to drawing portraits of the friends and colleagues around him. In small increments, he continued to work on an elaborate rock garden, often seeking seclusion there with thoughts of his homeland. He went so far as to construct a fountain and waterfall, carrying baskets of soil to the rocky site to provide flowers. Kosciuszko had the good fortune, during the West Point years, to enjoy the company of one close friend. At the age of 18, Agrippa Hull, a free-born black man, applied to serve in the Continental Army, and he ended up spending 5 years as Kosciuszko's aide. Hull later became a medical assistant and performed simple operations, such as amputations and bone settings. During this time with Patterson and Kosciuszko in early 1777, Hull had established a mutual chemistry and an affinity for freedom on the individual level. Kosciuszko had fought for such a cause in his home country of Poland, but despite his vast studies he was less well educated about the black Americans' situation. When they met again, Hull helped his new commanding officer complete his American education, forever altering Kosciuszko's worldview and extraordinary zeal for personal equality. At West Point, Hull served as far more than a mere orderly. Countless conversations with Kosciuszko were mutually inspiring, to the point that both became fierce abolitionists. The common thread was Jefferson's famous document, which had caused Kosciuszko to weep upon his arrival. As friends, notions of rank and military formality virtually disappeared between the two. One famous anecdote corroborates both men's passion for equality. Kosciuszko departed West Point for 3 days to examine his positions, but rather than appointing a subordinate officer to remain in command, he left Hull in charge of both troops and civilians. It's hard to imagine how unprecedented a choice it was to appoint a black man over white troops in the 18th century. Dedicated as he was to a high level of service, Hull possessed an almost uncontrollable sense of humor as well. With Kosciuszko scarcely out of sight, he called every slave and freeman in West Point to assemble at his commander's headquarters for a night of feasting and drinking. As the ringmaster of the event, he donned Kosciuszko's dress uniform, a luxurious ensemble including a navy blue coat, elegant cherry collar, four-cornered hat with ostrich feather, a sash, sword, and shining epaulets. Since Kosciuszko had taken his good boots, Hull had to make do with painting his legs to imitate the presence of footwear. Parading as the new commander, he ordered his guests about, making the most absurd requests and feigning hysterical dissatisfaction when they were poorly fulfilled. Finally, he ordered a glass of water before turning it away once delivered, but things all came to a head when the glass was delivered to him on bended knee by a bowing and scraping Kosciuszko, who had returned to quite a ruckus. A general state of alarm erupted, once Hull recognized his commanding officer, and he later recalled that drawing a breath had been difficult at that moment. The guests, expecting to be whipped within an inch of their lives, hurled themselves out windows and escaped through whatever doors did not take them within reach of Kosciuszko. Hull, certain that he would die for his brazen behavior, began to beg for mercy before Kosciuszko had even said a word. Hull may not have remembered at that moment that his commander had refused one promotion after another and was generally dismissive of rank. As the poor orderly waited for the blow to fall, Kosciuszko straightened the uniform and instructed him not to speak, only to obey his hand signals. For the remainder of the evening, he escorted Hull from one officer's tent to another in full military dress, introducing him to the company of West Point as a visiting African prince. Although Hull was familiar to many of the men at West Point, not one individual appeared to recognize him as Kosciuszko's orderly. In a state of profound embarrassment, Hull continued to fret over certain punishment, but it never came. In the coming years, the story about Hull's use of Kosciuszko's uniform became a favorite of the descendants and friends of both men. Thanks to Saratoga and West Point, Kosciuszko's work as an engineer catapulted him to fame. From 1780 and into the following decade, he became a recurring symbol in American literature and poetry. Poet David Humphreys, who had served with Kosciuszko as a companion in the North and a member of a group commonly known as the Connecticut Wits, publicized the first efforts that turned the Pole into a national American hero. He penned numerous tributes to the newfound champion of Jefferson's doctrine of individual equality. In part, the frenzy over Washington's brilliant engineer was fed by an anecdote claiming that Kosciuszko offered to trade a captured British officer in return for a single slave held by British forces. Humphreys was later sent to Paris on a commerce mission by the Secretary of State. There he publicized the famous quip, "Our Polish friend, whose name still sounds so hard, to make it rhyme would puzzle any bard." Kosciuszko's personal euphoria following his time at West Point was unbounded. He declared in an August letter to General Gates, "I consider America my second country." In public, he gleefully announced on several occasions that he considered himself more than half a Yankee. However, he could not go long without a new mission, and he grew restless, waiting for the next project after such an exhausting and solitary existence at West Point. Joining the American Revolution. In November 1771, Pulaski was convicted of treason, despite his continued absence from the country. The prosecution held that his military raids performed at the time of the abduction were intended as a diversionary tactic, and he was sent into exile. Austria and Prussia maintained that Pulaski's intent was the crime of intended regicide, the killing of a king. His written rebuttal, in which he claimed no such intent, nevertheless confirmed that he was aware that an abduction was in progress. No longer able to find haven in Austria, he fled to Turkey in 1772. Later that year, he headed to the city of Nantes in France, eventually finding his way to Paris. Before long, Pulaski found life in a major European city intolerable, especially since it was far from the action between Poland and her foes, and because his life had stagnated with sparse opportunity to practice his career. In May 1773, he temporarily relocated again, this time to Dresden, due to its proximity to Poland. But while in Dresden, Pulaski received notice of his final conviction of treason, and he was stripped of all dignities and honors on June 7, 1773. Warned to avoid traveling in Poland at the cost of his life, Pulaski entered Turkey. On September 25th, operating under the alias of Corwin, he met with leaders of the Generality in Strasbourg, and he announced his willingness to participate in the war between Turkey and Russia. In the early months of 1774, Pulaski left Paris once again, this time sailing to Venice and Dubrovnik in order to reach the Turkish army fighting at the mouth of the Danube River. Finally, he reached the vizier's camp near the town of Varna in present-day Bulgaria. After attempting to form an Ottoman confederation along the lines of the Polish organization, the Turkish forces with which he allied himself were routed by the Russians. Pulaski barely escaped by sea and returned to France by way of Marseille. The return journey to Paris took 3 months. Yet again, life in France deteriorated almost immediately, as Pulaski lived on various loans and allowances, an unaccustomed and uncomfortable existence for an aristocrat. Casting about for military employment, he was unable to find an army willing to make use of his skills and experience, and on several occasions he spent time in prison for failure to repay debts. Despite the hardships, the French government understood that his military prowess was extraordinary, and as the French began to develop relations with the rebellious American colonies in 1775, Pulaski was recommended to the Second Continental Congress, General George Washington, and the American diplomats in France. In 1777, Pulaski met with Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador, who successfully induced him to favor the plight of the colonies. Impressed with the encounter, in particular Pulaski's personal ideals in the fight for independence, Franklin recommended him to Washington, writing, "Count Pulaski of Poland, an officer famous throughout Europe for his bravery and conduct in defense of the liberties of his country against the 3 great invading powers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, may be highly useful to our service." Initially, Washington was somewhat more skeptical, despite Franklin's description of Pulaski as an officer renowned throughout Europe for his courage and bravery. Other European military officers had already come to the colonies in search of adventure, and they'd had mixed results. However, Pulaski's case was supported by his friend Claude Carloman de Roulière, a French writer and historian, through the Marquis de Lafayette, already a legendary figure in the Americas. Eventually, a group of American commissioners paid for Pulaski's voyage from France to the city of Boston. Departing from Nantes in June, Count Casimir Pulaski arrived in Marblehead, Massachusetts, on July 23, 1777. When greeted upon his arrival, he reportedly declared, "I came here where freedom is being defended, to serve it, and to live or die for it." General Washington and Pulaski met on August 20th at the general's headquarters near Neshaminy Falls, situated between Trenton and Philadelphia. Wasting no time, Pulaski applied to Congress for a military commission on August 24th. After a brief stay in Boston, he returned to the new headquarters at Moland House in Warwick Township, Pennsylvania. Whether by a sense of caution or a procedural difficulty, Washington was unable to offer the newcomer an officer's commission at the time of their meeting. So over the following weeks, Pulaski traveled from headquarters to Congress, eagerly awaiting an appointment. In that time, Pulaski unexpectedly served General Washington by alerting him to British movements in his area. With the benefit of that information, Washington was prepared to meet General William Howe's forces near Malvern, Pennsylvania, for the Battle of White Horse Tavern, better known as the abortive Battle of the Clouds, on September 15th. The latter moniker became the enduring one when inordinately heavy rains made fighting impossible, causing both sides to withdraw. Pulaski, interested as he might have been in a revolutionary belief and the concept of equality, despite his former status as an aristocrat, prized a congressional commission. This was needed not only for positions of leadership, but to rejuvenate his wavering reputation in Europe, particularly in Poland. His application to Congress was laced with daring plans and theoretical mission strategies, such as capturing the French-held island of Madagascar in an effort to demonstrate his zeal. In addition, Pulaski revealed a central flaw in the American forces. The highest-ranking officers, including Washington, had no significant appreciation for or knowledge of European-style cavalry units. Despite Washington's description of Pulaski as a daring and energetic horseman, The use of dragoon units on horseback as high-speed raiders to harass enemies on the march was a glaring American weakness. Colonel Kajanki, who wrote extensively on the subject, suggests that in the beginning Washington was a rather mediocre general at best. In the first battles of the war, according to Kajanki, the commander-in-chief was hesitant, opinionated, and frequently ill-informed. Unable to appreciate the value of cavalry until the latter stages of the war, the best use of a unit such as Pulaski's cavalry was beyond his comprehension. From a scholarly point of view, Kajanki's views were likely overstating Washington's deficiencies, in part as a form of supporting his fellow countrymen, but his assessment of the woeful lack of cavalry combat in the American military structure was certainly correct. Pulaski was eventually given the chance to prove his point, receiving his men and horses, but due to the leadership's insufficient faith in the unit's value, men from Pulaski's company were constantly stripped away to be employed in other tasks. Washington may have understood the advantage of mobility offered by cavalry units, but he did not fully embrace the use of cavalry as a shock force, as Napoleon would come to do so brilliantly a generation later. Devotees to direct offensive military action often criticize Washington in this way, dismissing his use of a Fabian strategy during the Revolution as timidity. Named for a Roman general who fought Hannibal during the Second Punic War, the tactic has been used throughout history as a method of wearing down a larger enemy in a war of attrition. Battles involving large numbers are avoided, and constant harassment of the enemy's periphery is crucial. By contrast, Washington is cast by many supporters as a master of the offensive retreat. Widespread consensus holds that had the general confronted Britain in force at every turn, the American cause would have been lost at the beginning. Authors such as Kajanki failed to mention that Pulaski himself employed the Fabian strategy in his successful siege defenses against superior forces. With or without the commission, sitting still and waiting for events to unfold was simply impossible for someone like Pulaski. His first battle on American soil under the command of George Washington took place at Brandywine Creek, 25 miles to the west of Philadelphia. British elements arrived under General Wilhelm von Knyphausen along the Great Road leading to the city, and General Cornwallis and his forces were a walking day's distance off. A company of British cavalry, comprised of American loyalists, was present on the perimeter, accompanied by a separate unit of German Jaegers traveling on foot. Although the term Jaeger translates to hunter, the description is used to signify German light infantry. The collision of British and American forces occurred 4 miles west of the creek, and the battle is also remembered as Chad's Ford or Welch's Tavern. When the firing commenced, Washington was unaware that Cornwallis's forces were marching from a distance of 17 miles in an effort to flank the Americans to the right. Cornwallis took 9 hours for his troops to cover the distance. The Jaegers shifted to the right as well, presumably to join with Cornwallis's effort. Pulaski, from higher ground, was able to watch the progression where Washington was not. Once the American general understood the British strategy, he chose not to move against the flanking strategy, but instead proceeded north and directly attacked Cornwallis, who had settled on Osborne Hill, favorable high ground. British troops were resting from the day's march, and Washington's maneuver may have been based on that knowledge. Pulaski, sensing that the battle would be a lengthy one, took the time to personally examine the weaponry of each soldier in his company. Swords, pistols, and 400 horses all came under his direct scrutiny before taking the field. Once on ground suitable for viewing the entire theater, he remained at his position for nearly an hour, refusing to move until he knew precisely where each force was. Despite the incessant noise and unpredictable shifts of the battle, he continued to send out and receive small scouting parties, carrying precious information. Receiving an order to move forward and attack Knyphausen with Washington before Cornwallis's arrival, he hesitated a moment longer, keeping his eyes constantly to the right to see if he was being drawn into a flanking ambush. A soldier in Pulaski's company later recalled that once the intrepid Pulaski finally moved with speed and precision, the tall Pole, bare-headed, was like some warlike presence come up out of the solid earth. He further recollected that a cannon blast exploded on the very spot where his commanding officer had just stood, watching from his horse. Still observing the right, Pulaski could not help but sense that the order to attack forward might be countermanded. His suspicions proved to be correct, as Cornwallis, now in view, went off to another quarter on the right. The British line continued to fall away rightward, in an assumption that Washington was getting the worst of it and would soon seek escape in their direction. Pulaski and elements of his cavalry instantly changed course and moved quickly to the right, over fences and all manner of natural obstacles. In short order, Pulaski found ground offering a favorable opportunity. As expected, Washington had wandered into a superior force on better ground and was indeed seeking escape to the right. Pulaski quickly rallied 30 of his cavalry, a sufficient number for cutting off the enemy from Washington's retreat, and once clear, Pulaski covered the rear of Washington's unit until a safe location was reached. In congressional circles, Pulaski's alertness became known as his first blow in defense of American liberty. 4 days after Brandywine, the Congressional Commission was approved, naming Pulaski a brigadier general and general of cavalry. A few hundred men were provided to be trained by Pulaski, and he used the time before their arrival to pen new regulations to achieve the kind of discipline enjoyed by European cavalry units. Unfortunately for the colonies, the Battle of Brandywine put the city of Philadelphia in a vulnerable position, and within a day or two the British secured the city, leaving a garrison there of almost 4,000 soldiers. In a startling perspective, the British and American forces that met at Chad's Ford in rural Delaware County, Pennsylvania, numbered 30,000. The ground became a historic site in future years, and the Continental encampment was estimated to take up 52 acres. In 1 day of battle, the Continental Army lost 1,100 men, and almost all available artillery. Soon after Brandywine, Washington's new brigadier general of cavalry joined the American foot soldiers at the Battle of Germantown, as it is sometimes called, or the Battle of Warren's Tavern. With a new commission and at least a moral victory in hand, Pulaski had purportedly exceeded the boundary of a fussy officer to that of a zealot. He demanded much of his men, in part because they had so much to learn and so little time with which to perfect European-style cavalry combat before their lives were put on the line. Complaining of erratic, often non-existent funding from the Congress, Pulaski used personal resources to purchase and repair equipment. Pulaski acquitted himself well in the fight at Germantown, but the Continental Army suffered severe casualties, twice the number incurred on the British. 4 roads led into Germantown, and Washington, sensing that the splitting of Howe's forces would leave them weakened, decided that the Americans should attack in 4 columns. Such a plan may have been possible, with polished, experienced military veterans, but the Americans could not manage the task of coordinating their attacks. Sullivan's company took care of the British sentry line, but they did not charge the main body, and Greene entered the fray too late and became lost in the fog before colliding with Sullivan. Both thought the other to be the enemy and fired before retreating. General Stevens led his men into the battle in an inebriated state, and his unit fared poorly. Washington thought to send repeated waves of attack against the central British force, but they were bloodied each time. The coming of winter was in one sense a reprieve against further defeats, although Washington's subsequent relocation to Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 was a period of misery. While the Continental Army would be drilled into a more professional fighting force by Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, the weather was unusually poor, and many men died in camp. During the winter, Pulaski was often in Trenton, Flemington, and Little Egg Harbor in New Jersey, guarding supplies. When in Valley Forge, he took to patrolling the perimeter. Pulaski's Legion. As the fate of Washington's army and the Revolution hung in the balance, Pulaski went on as best he could under present circumstances, aiding Brigadier General Anthony Wayne in actions around Haddonfield, New Jersey. Wayne, among all the generals of the war, may have been the most perfectly suited to Pulaski's attacking style. Renowned for being daring and aggressive, his troops bestowed upon him the moniker Mad Anthony. When Howe sent troops from Philadelphia to forage for food, Wayne collected 150 head of cattle to deny them to the enemy. Outnumbered by the arriving British, Haddonfield was evacuated, and the Americans retreated to Cooper's Ferry a few miles away. There, on February 28, 1778, both Wayne and Pulaski skirmished with Howe's forces, who were only able to return with 50 head of cattle. Pulaski's cavalry counterpart among the British forces, John Simcoe's Hussars, appeared in that exchange. Disgruntled, Pulaski requested a release from his command, and he eventually resigned in March. His initial intent was to return to Europe, but following the Haddonfield action he returned to Valley Forge before going on to Yorktown. There he met with General Horatio Gates, who had commanded colonial forces at the Battle of Saratoga and was once considered an apt replacement for the faltering General Washington. The meeting must have gone well, for a rejuvenated Pulaski was reconfirmed as brigadier general. The title of Commander of the Horse was added, and on March 28, 1778, he was given permission to assemble a new unit, generally independent, to work in tandem with the foot soldiers. Pulaski's vision of a company of lancers was approved, and within the following 2 months he was given 68 men to train, with the addition of 200 light infantry and an eventual force of 330 men. The Lancers, the vanguard of what came to be known as Pulaski's Legion, had its headquarters in Baltimore. The Legion featured a far more international group than Pulaski's Continental Army unit, consisting of volunteers from Hungary, Sweden, Italy, France, and the Americas. When the Legion formed, even the British troops and German Hessians took note. A German general issued a characterization for his commanders describing the life Pulaski's men would have to live, adding that their food and pay they must get through their own bravery. Although the Legion was headquartered in Baltimore, several additional recruiting centers opened in Washington, Trenton, Easton, Albany, Boston, and various locations in Virginia. Pulaski was given $10,000 for the purchase of horses and another $50,000 for training and equipment. Within a short period, the funding began to fall short, due in part to the devaluation of the continental dollar. On August 20, 1778, another $17,786 was authorized, working out to approximately $130 per legionnaire. These funds provided for 1 stock, 1 cap, 2 pair stockings, 2 pairs gaiters, 3 pairs shoes, 1 pair buckles, spear and cartouche box, 1 pair boots, a saddle, halters, currycomb, brush portmantle, picket cord, and pack saddle. Pulaski was given leave by Washington and Congress to select his own officers. He tended toward favoring Europeans, as their languages and customs were more familiar to him, and he even found a second-in-command from his own part of the world. Among his men were a number of deserters from both the British and the Hessians, so perhaps it's no surprise that desertion from his own ranks would in time become a problem, as it had for Washington. Rewards of $5 to $6 each were posted for the return of delinquent men. Generally ignorant of Army procedure or American law, Pulaski recruited troops from the units of other officers, and he was officially rebuked for the practice by Congress. When he turned to recruiting prisoners and prisoners of war, he was rebuked again, this time by Washington, who ordered that they be returned. Eventually Washington set quotas for the number of enemy deserters in the Legion. The Legion's banner was, according to some, donated by the Moravian nuns of Bethlehem in the city of Baltimore, while others suggest that Pulaski purchased it from the order. In a politically wise move, Pulaski and his second-in-command, Colonel Kovatz, attended the nuns' services on April 16, 1778, the celebration of Holy Thursday. A second visit came soon after, and Pulaski posted a guard outside the sisters' door to guard against unruly troops. This was of special concern, as the Moravian nuns were not truly a religious order, but a service organization comprised of the unmarried women in the community. The standard presented to Pulaski and Kovatz was 18 inches square, and Pulaski was also given a flag. Excellent reviews of the Legion emerged almost immediately, with General Charles Lee praising the high level of training. Among the elite trainees was Light Horse Harry Lee, the father of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The elder Lee went on to serve as a model for his son and for cavalry operations in the Civil War. Meanwhile, Pulaski's legendary image began to take shape as the romantic embodiment of the new American saber soldier. Naturally, Pulaski's reputation as a daring cavalryman obscured much of the cavalry's reality, which required quieter, more mundane actions, like reconnaissance, covering retreats, and shuttling crucial intelligence across battlefields. Some of the controversies surrounding Pulaski's service in America never left him. Conflicts over the funding of the Legion arose between congressional factions, and Pulaski dealt with auditors for the rest of his life. Influential as he may have been with other military officers, based on his knowledge of the situation, he was far less successful with diplomats, congressmen, and local officials who bristled at his imperious behavior. He was infamous for commandeering whatever he needed from the populace without any sign of gratitude, and he increasingly ran into outright obstruction from local officials. Congress also began to resent his demands, and Pulaski's letters to military colleagues and friends bore a strain of melancholic disillusion. While the Pulaski Legion was in the midst of training to the south, the British evacuated Philadelphia, changing their emphasis to a southern front that included the cities of Georgia and South Carolina. As a result, only one more battle of major significance took place in the Philadelphia region. This was the Battle of Monmouth, fought in Freehold, New Jersey, and resulting in yet another victory for the British in June 1778. Pulaski was incensed at not being present for a battle in which a cavalry unit could have altered the results. Said to be furious, he doubled his efforts to complete the unit's training, unaware that other maddening situations would delay the Legion's deployment. Once prepared to march out as a valid fighting force, all of Pulaski's elements rendezvoused at Wilmington, Delaware, and by September 1778, the entire force reached Philadelphia for review. The Legion passed inspection brilliantly and was officially accepted into the Continental Army. However, as they prepared to depart for a first mission, the entire unit was detained. To Pulaski's astonishment, he was called to discuss multiple irregularities in his students' records and accounts with a congressional auditor. Once the matter was settled, the Legion again prepared to set out, only to hit another snag when Pulaski was ordered to appear in Princeton, New Jersey. A local magistrate had ordered the sheriff to serve Pulaski with a warrant for resisting civil authority in a case involving a wronged citizen. Pulaski appeared personally before the magistrate on October 2, 1778. Entirely unaware of the legal underpinnings of the conflict, the account in question was finally adjusted, and the creditor was satisfied. Barely 2 weeks after those decisions, Pulaski and the Legion were finally cleared to move. Death and Legacy. On October 15, 1778, Pulaski was ordered to Little Egg Harbor to protect American supplies. There his unit was badly mauled in a surprise attack by the British. Little Egg Harbor, located to the southeast of Philadelphia in New Jersey, was the site of a quiet war between American privateers and British troops acting surreptitiously to prevent marauding against British ships. Captain Patrick Ferguson was wreaking havoc in any way he could against colonial shipping, simultaneously suppressing privateers. Pulaski was ordered to resist Ferguson as best he could, so he camped along the Mullica River with the newly trained cavalry unit and 3 companies of light infantry, 3 troops of light horse, and 1 artillery detachment. The bulk of men under his command were deserters, unwanted anywhere in the vicinity of General Washington, and a small group of foreign adventurers. Although Pulaski arrived too late to stop Ferguson entirely, he was able to prevent an attack on the ironworks at Batstow, and he successfully interfered with several assaults on the privateers, but his luck was not to last. One of the deserters informed Ferguson of the whereabouts of Pulaski's camp on a farm close to the river's edge, and in response Ferguson gathered a force of 250 men from the 70th Regiment, the 3rd New Jersey Tory Regiment, comprised of American Loyalists, and a substantial naval force. Ferguson's raiding party rode in the darkness for a distance of 10 miles. Reaching Osborne's Island, they walked 2 more miles to Pulaski's infantry post and encountered 50 men a short distance from the main encampment. At approximately 4 a.m., Ferguson charged 3 houses and bayoneted 50 American troops. Pulaski heard the commotion and quickly rallied his dragoons, driving Ferguson's party back to their boats. The British were later accused of having committed an illegal massacre, but the British commander denied all charges. Despite Pulaski's attention to detail and excellent training methods, morale was low within the unit. He still possessed little or no command of the English language, and the Americans displayed a general resentment toward serving a foreign officer, particularly one with such an imperious personality. Pulaski's tendency to cause friction with everyone grew tiresome at every level of command, and even fellow Poles were put off by his personal style of leadership. Ideas about European discipline and techniques bred discontent despite the lack of a sustainable alternative, and to exacerbate the situation, pay was in arrears from Congress. In July 1779, Pulaski and his legion were ordered north to the township of Minisink in the upper Delaware River Valley. The British had forged alliances, usually through bribery, with elements of the northern tribes, predominantly Iroquois, and loyalists from the region were interspersed within these hostile elements. On July 19, 1778, a large band of Iroquois attacked the town, burning homes and barns and inflicting a significant loss of property. The Goshen Regiment was sent out to defend the town and pursued the attackers several miles to Beaver Creek. A battle ensued, and the regiment took heavy loss of life, including Colonel Tustin and several officers. Captain Wood was taken prisoner. On July 22nd, Pulaski joined the fray, and the raids were suppressed. But he believed being assigned to such a mission was a distraction from his role in the revolution. He had come to fight the British troops, not their paid lackeys. The tactics of European-style cavalry were somewhat unsuitable for such a combat scenario, and Pulaski complained that his command was too tame, and that there was nothing to fight but bears. Again, Pulaski prepared a letter of resignation to Congress, but he withdrew it upon his reassignment to the Southern Front in South Carolina and Georgia. After General Gates stopped a British invasion from Quebec at Saratoga, and France declared war on Britain, the strategy to win overwhelming victories in the northern colonies took a back seat to a focus on the southern colonies. Switching to a strategy of attacking port cities, the British leadership shifted their troops and naval forces southward in order to choke off American naval and land movement in and around Savannah and Charleston. Savannah was already captured, and the siege of Charleston portended further disaster for the Continental Army and militias. Sir Henry Clinton left the New York garrison under the care of Knyphausen and sailed south to support the British. The British presumed to hold an additional advantage in the south in the belief that many loyalists in the region would rise up in rebellion. At the time, no functional colonial army was left in the south to prevent a British takeover. Even the combined Franco-American forces were not enough. However, the French Navy was increasing its participation, and the Loyalist uprising never materialized. In the rural areas throughout the southern states, the conflict was reduced to pockets of guerrilla warfare in small numbers. On May 8, 1779, Pulaski and his legion arrived in Charleston. There he joined with General Benjamin Lincoln, who had recently retreated from Savannah and was pursued by advancing British units moving north. To cover Lincoln's retreat and reorganization at Charleston, Pulaski engaged the forward elements of the enemy's march and was almost destroyed entirely, leaving 60 men dead on the field. He retreated to the safety of the city, still in possession of defensive artillery. At the time, his action took his unit too far from such protection, and the decision was described as ill-judged, ill-conducted, disgraceful, and disastrous. Stricken with malaria, Pulaski continued to lead raids in the area, some a great deal more successful. An American naval force of 4 ships, under Commodore Whipple, attempted to block the harbor to Sir Clinton, but thought better of it and scuttled his own ships, removing the cannon to shore defenses. Governor Rutledge ordered 600 slaves to erect fortifications, but only the mobile horseback units were still capable of significant movement. Pulaski captured a British outpost near the Ogeechee River, and on May 8th joined with American and French forces in an attempt to break the siege. Eventually, Clinton shelled Charleston from the harbor, employing heated shot that set many of the city's structures on fire. Those who could avoid the surrender moved on, including Pulaski, who arrived in Savannah on September 14th and assisted in a siege on British forces holding the city. Retaking Savannah should have been one of the Franco-American alliance's best opportunities during the campaign in the South. The French Navy entered the city's port with 47 ships, carrying 5,000 soldiers, a number that included 500 Haitians. Admiral Hector d'Estaing joined forces with General Lincoln and demanded that the British commander surrender the city at once. But Augustin Prevost requested a delay of 24 hours in which to discuss the matter with his officers, and the French and Americans unwisely agreed to the ploy. During that time, 800 or more British reinforcements arrived, after which Prevost refused to vacate or surrender. The Navy bombarded the town at length, followed by a direct land assault that utterly failed. Britain maintained control of the city for another 3 years, and Georgia remained the sole colony retaken by George III's combined army and navy. In the land action, Pulaski found himself in encounters with a variety of enemy units, including Arthur Dillon and his Wild Geese of Ireland, makeshift units comprised of American slaves, loyalists, and groups of Native Americans. When news reached Pulaski that d'Estaing was wounded, he lost all patience and moved to forward ground, frustrated at the delays to the land assault. Leaving the cover of the woods to investigate the field, Pulaski, who was in charge of both American and French cavalry forces at this point, was accompanied by Captain Paul Bentelou, the second in command. According to Bentelou, Pulaski found himself in a crossfire, realizing too late that the French had mistimed the assault due to fog. Other accounts suggest an opposite sequence of events, claiming that d'Estaing attacked prematurely, and that due to the fog directions became confused. The Americans and French were thrown off the plan's timing and could not recover. However it happened, Pulaski, alone in the front lines, was hit by a cannon blast, striking him with grape-shot in the thigh. Assuming that their commander was dead, the cavalry and foot soldiers under his command, sensing the futility of an assault, retreated. One of the most credible popular accounts, despite being one of the most poetic as well, is found among the works of Southern author Bernard Preston Wolfe, a noted physician in the Atlanta area. Wolfe's ancestor served with d'Estaing and claims to have witnessed Pulaski's death in Savannah. One might wonder at the physical distance between Pulaski and d'Estaing, as the Pole required a messenger on the battlefield to inform him of the French leader's wounds, yet Wolfe's witness writes that the general stood upon the saddle, grasped the pommel with both hands, then, in a moment of disbelief, slid into the arms of Ambrose and his staff officers. Bentelou managed to remove Pulaski from the field, and out of respect for the fallen cavalryman, the British held their fire until Pulaski was taken safely away. Physician James Lina was able to remove the grape-shot from Pulaski's leg, and he later claimed that he could have saved the officer's life had he remained in camp. However, Pulaski was relocated to the USS Wasp for transport out of the battle zone, and died on the ship. His death reportedly came on October 9, 1779, at the age of 34. Alternate accounts claim that Pulaski's date of death was October 11th, and others claim that he lingered on to October 15th. Pulaski never married, and it is generally accepted that he has no living descendants. Several witnesses close to the event maintain that Pulaski was buried at sea, a theory spawning multiple sub-narratives. According to this belief, the most likely location was the spot where the Savannah River meets the Atlantic. However, Samuel Bulfinch, the captain of the Wasp, may have been misunderstood. His letters suggest that the burial at sea was ceremonial, and that Pulaski was laid to rest on land while the Wasp was moored. Coffins were not the norm in time of war, but ship steward and purser Eleazar Phillips claims to have fashioned a coffin for Pulaski's burial on October 15th. The Greenwich plantation family, the Bowens, passed word of the burial down to their descendants, and the grave was frequently shown to visitors and young family members. News of Pulaski's death sent a shockwave through the American public, and his legend as an American patriot was forged almost instantly. While witnesses and archivists grappled with the exact nature of his death, Germantown, Pennsylvania changed its name to Pulaski Town. In Virginia, the General Pulaski Social Club was established, and Kentucky established a Pulaski City. The idea that Pulaski was buried at sea lost favor through the years, following a symbolic funeral in 1793 in the city of Charleston. That year, relative Antoni Pulaski obtained an official government renunciation of the hero's sentence from actions committed 26 years prior in Poland. Despite much mention in the literary works of his native country, his estates were eventually confiscated by the occupying Russians. In 1824, former Captain Bentelou penned an essay entitled Pulaski Vindicated from an Unsupported Charge, and took direct exception to his purported burial at sea. The essay asserts that Bentelou's commanding officer died of gangrene in the city of Savannah. The added claim that he was buried in South Carolina on the grounds of Greenwich Plantation, Tybee Island, near Thunderbolt, has been widely corroborated. The Bowens of Greenwich Plantation, passionate American patriots, supported the captain's letter from the Wasp and continued to insist that a burial at sea was more ceremonial than actual. In the same year, Savannah erected a 55-foot obelisk in Pulaski's honor in Monterey Square. The cornerstone for Pulaski's monument in Savannah was laid by Lafayette himself at Chippewa Square. The French legend, perhaps the only foreign soldier in the American Revolution to outshine Pulaski in fame, was making a grand tour of the United States, and during it he praised Pulaski's memory. The debate surrounding Pulaski's death raged through the following decades, and in 1825 Major Bowen of Greenwich again addressed the conflict head-on. Engaging a crew of diggers, the remains in the Greenwich tomb were exhumed and sent to a medical college for a period of 8 months. With what technology was available, medical personnel could only confirm that the subject stood at 5'3", was slender, and was approximately 34 years of age. The stature and age were cross-referenced against previously known injuries with a satisfactory comparison. Peripheral theories go so far as to posit that the medical college discovered that Pulaski was indeed female and working in disguise. Bolstered by observations that he had no wish for relationships or the trappings of male friendship, the idea flourished briefly, but it found no historical or medical traction in the modern age. Further upgrades to the Savannah Monument were completed in 1885, designed by Robert Launitz. Meanwhile, the Greenwich Plantation remains were relocated to Monterey Square and placed in an underground brick-lined crypt. The congressional resolution for the Savannah Monument was written and passed many years before, but no action was taken in building it until a decade before the Civil War. The statue was a joint project between local and regional militia units, local Masonic lodges, and a number of notable citizens. Historians suspect that Pulaski was a member of the Masonic order, based on the full Masonic ceremony performed by the high priest of the Georgia chapter. A bust of Pulaski was added to the United States Capitol in 1867. A new government installation, Fort Cockspur Island outside the city of Savannah, was christened Fort Pulaski. The theory of Masonic membership was revived in 2009 with the discovery of circumstantial evidence in Maryland indicating that he was a lodge member there. A lodge in Chicago exists under the name of Casimir Pulaski Lodge, number 1167. A brochure offered by the lodge claims that Pulaski was indeed a member, and that he attained the level of Master Mason on June 19, 1779. Although he was buried with full Masonic honors, no surviving documents exist as absolute proof. Pulaski's legend seeped into every form of expression available to military heroes. In 1890, Edward Sobolewski composed a full-length opera about the last days of Pulaski's life. Entitled Mohiga, it had sporadic performances. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow penned the Hymn of the Moravian Nuns at Bethlehem at the consecration of Pulaski's banner. By the end of the 19th century, many towns, counties, and landmarks had been named after the Polish officer. In the state of Illinois, boasting a large Polish population in the city of Chicago and elsewhere, Casimir Pulaski Day is regularly celebrated on the first Monday in March, commemorating his birthday. Pulaski's biography as a prominent figure occupies an important place in the state's school curriculum. For the day's celebration, a few banks, schools, libraries, and even municipal courts are closed. In addition, public transit alters the daily schedule. A new statue honoring Pulaski was unveiled in Washington, D.C. by President Howard Taft on May 11, 1910, and that same year the Casimir Pulaski Museum was also opened in the capital. The Pulaski State Park covers 4,000 acres on George Washington Avenue in the Washington, D.C. area. The arts again took up Pulaski's story when Adolf Nowozorycki's play Pulaski vs. America opened in 1917. 10 years later, a Pulaski museum in Krynica was completed, the first ever established on Polish soil. Even modern media has not entirely forgotten Pulaski's exploits. In The Mysterious Stranger, a 1960s episode of the American television western Sugarfoot, a character named Frederick Pulaski is featured. The writer mistakenly conflates the family connection of Casimir Pulaski with that of Paderewski, concert pianist and later premier of Poland. The character is portrayed by Adam West, best known for his role as Batman. In 1964, the United States Navy commissioned a submarine honoring Pulaski, along with a U.S. Revenue Cutter Service vessel acting on behalf of the U.S. Treasury's monitoring of customs. Fort Pulaski still functions after its commission in the Civil War. A second museum in Poland opened its doors in 1967 in the town of Warka, boasting 11,000 inhabitants. Of the papers delivered there by historians and fellow academics was a presentation by Edward Pinkowski. Historians have hailed Pinkowski for his writings on Polish subjects around the world, and credit him with saving certain events from oblivion. In 2000, the USS Clark, an American frigate, was decommissioned and sent to the Polish Navy, where it was rechristened the Kazimierz Pulaski. Pulaski's remains in the Monterey Square crypt in Savannah were once again exhumed in 1996, in the early years of work with DNA. Unfortunately, the samples were contaminated by water damage, and the results were inconclusive. Hopes for a subsequent examination with more advanced technology are ongoing. The Savannah General Pulaski Committee was formed on March 1, 2004, for the promotion of Casimir Pulaski's achievements. On that date, the committee celebrated Pulaski's 269th birthday, an event that brought a host of regional politicians and included a Daytona Beach Sunday dinner and dance. In 2005, Pulaski's remains were reinterred with full military honors, and 4 years later a U.S. congressional resolution conferred a status of honorary U.S. citizen on the fallen hero, one of only 7 individuals in the nation's history to receive it. President Barack Obama signed it on November 6, 2009. Columbia College historian Dominic Paciaga characterizes the way in which Pulaski perceived the American Revolution as being identical to the way he regarded the fight for independence in Poland. This is the idea passed on to Polish children in the United States, which holds Pulaski out as Poland's Martin Luther King, both as a martyr and a champion. Vividly remembered by Poles who made their way to the United States in the 20th century, the legend of Pulaski is employed as a symbol to remind Americans of non-Eastern European heritage that one of Poland's own was central to the country's well-being. It is also raised as a useful argument for one's own safety as a Polish American in the face of anti-immigrant sentiments. The director of the Polish Museum in Chicago, Małgorzata Kot, notes that the attachment to Pulaski is heightened to the extreme because he was a soldier. A concert pianist prime minister or a beloved national poet would do well for other occasions, but would have been poorly suited for the birth pains of an outnumbered group of colonies. A commemorative ceremony unveiled an equestrian statue in Washington, D.C. in 2007, with the subject clad in the uniform of a Polish officer. The banner of Pulaski's Legion, obtained from the Moravian nuns in Baltimore, was returned to that order, and it now resides in the Museum of the Maryland Historical Society. It features a field of yellow silk with the words United States in the center. In a circle around them is the phrase, Union makes valor, in italics. On the reverse side are 13 stars that surround a 6-pointed star seeing eye within a triangle, a base positioned at the top, and 4 bombs, one in each corner. In Latin are inscribed the words, No other governs. In addition to academic investigation into the life of Casimir Pulaski, much work has been contributed by Polish authors, historians, novelists, and playwrights. Some of the scholarly works require translation from Polish in various sources, and others serve more as patriotic tributes on behalf of the Polish people. A natural bias removes many documents from serious factual consideration, such as those that laud miraculous military victories and remains quiet about defeats. Popular accounts are frequently sown from secondary sources, throwing no new light on the topic at hand. Still a vital figure for the Polish-American population and its justification for participating in the American experiment, the Knight of Liberty receives liberal treatment as a patriotic exhortation in the Polish tongue. Unlike Lafayette, A charismatic and valorous guest of the American colonies' efforts, Pulaski came to North America as a true rebel, exiled from his homeland, and while his impetuous manner offered a daunting presence on the battlefield, his influence on a generation of horse soldiers changed the country's military paradigm for over a century. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the United States military still boasts cavalry units, though mechanized movement is subsumed under the term. Modern cavalry charges on horseback are well documented in the modern American military in remote locales, such as Afghanistan. The Pulaski barracks are in use at the Kaiserslautern Army base in Germany, and an important security-oriented think tank bears his name in Poland. Growing up with a culture whose love for independence had gone dormant after centuries of suppression, Pulaski's destiny was to help prevent the nascent American experiment from suffering the same fate. Kosciuszko in the South. With British fortunes waning in the north, King George III's generals opened a new front in the south, believing that loyalists among the rural populace would rise up to support them in vast numbers. Cornwallis, Clinton, and others moved south to coordinate the capture of major American seaports, while large American units marched south to meet them in the hope of liberating those cities and ports already lost, chiefly Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Kosciuszko was elated when Gates called for him to move south with his troops. The role of engineer would soon expand into that of soldier, as he took leadership of his own unit of light infantry. The advent of a new mission rejuvenated Kosciuszko, and he was relieved to be rid at last of Benedict Arnold. Most of Kosciuszko's papers on West Point were destroyed in a fire, and their loss was generally considered a blessing, considering Arnold's betrayal and the constant danger that they might fall into enemy hands. Other aristocrats from Poland, such as cavalryman Casimir Pulaski, joined the march south, and officers from several other European countries were intensely involved in the conflict. The French also appeared in force. By the summer of 1780, Kosciuszko arrived at the loosely formed Southern Front, serving with General Nathaniel Greene in South Carolina. Greene, a native Rhode Islander, was considered among the best of the American generals, and he was unofficially designated as Washington's successor in the event of the commanding general's death. They had served together at the Siege of Boston, around New York City, in Trenton, and later at Brandywine and Germantown. Ironically, Greene was a Quaker, but he was ejected from the faith when he was observed marching in a military parade. Greene succeeded Gates as commander of the Southern Army, and Kosciuszko accompanied him as chief engineer. The southern region was unfamiliar to Greene, and generally difficult to navigate. Kosciuszko made a daily regimen of scouting rivers and encampment sites, constructing unique new methods for transporting men and supplies, and building fortifications across the South. In January of 1781, he was involved in the Battle of Cowpens. Daniel Morgan's riflemen were en route to attack a major British outpost called 96. General Tarleton was sent in pursuit with a large British contingent for fear of a backwoods rebellion emerging among the populace. When they met, Morgan's men were instructed to fire only twice before breaking ranks. The British, assuming they were on the verge of routing Daniels, rushed forward into a massive burst of fire. The British dead numbered over 800. In February of 1781, Kosciuszko conducted an extensive exploration of the Catawba and Pedee rivers by canoe, regularly reporting to Greene about the ease of transporting supplies and the whereabouts of various avenues of retreat. In one campaign, during which Cornwallis attempted to put an end to the entire enemy army, Greene's forces were pursued in a mad dash retreat that covered an area of 200 miles. Kosciuszko rescued Greene's force on 2 occasions by building a combination of wagons and flat-bottomed boats, suitable for quick escapes with supplies intact across the Yadkin and Dan rivers. A grateful Greene called Kosciuszko one of the most helpful and congenial companions, blessed with perseverance, determination, and indefatigable efforts, not to mention incomparable modesty. By the spring of 1781, preparations for an attack on Outpost 96 were complete. Among the well-defended posts in the southern front, Kosciuszko scouted enemy positions at length for Greene. Smaller outposts had been captured in the Carolinas and Georgia, but the general sought one more significant victory. Kosciuszko's recommendation required a daunting attack on the Star Fort, the strongest component and the command center. The siege continued for 28 days and included some of the most inventive engineering feats of the war. Kosciuszko constructed a system of saps and parallels that enabled his men to make a close approach to the fort. The saps, trenches dug in zigzag fashion extending toward the enemy, eventually connected with parallel outer trenches on either side of the target. Digging was slowed by what Kosciuszko referred to as soft stone, but 3 of the saps were completed in 3 weeks. The ultimate goal was to tunnel underneath the Star Fort, create a chamber large enough to hold explosives, and detonate them before being discovered. So close were the Americans to the British lines that Kosciuszko unexpectedly received a bayonet wound in the buttocks, leaning over to inspect one of his fortifications. A British observer satirically remarked, "Never did luckless wit receive a more inglorious wound." Kosciuszko soon recovered. To all intents and purposes, the American Revolution ended in the autumn of 1781, even though the Treaty of Paris was not to be signed for another 2 years. New York was still occupied, and Washington was dealing with widespread desertion. However, the French landed 6,000 troops in Rhode Island. Washington desired the recapture of New York, but inevitably marched south with Comte de Rochambeau to face Cornwallis. Having captured Charleston, Savannah, and Richmond, Cornwallis marched north toward the Chesapeake in anticipation of enjoying naval support. However, the French Navy sailed from the Caribbean to surprise Cornwallis at the head of the Chesapeake, and the British fleet was forced to move north. This left Cornwallis stranded, and his only option was to surrender at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. All in all, the surrender included over 7,000 officers and men, almost 1,000 seamen, 144 artillery pieces, 15 galleys, 1 frigate, and 30 transport ships. Military actions continued as British units up and down the continent were beaten back. By the autumn of 1782, Kosciuszko was made a field commander, and he led skirmishes around Charleston in the waning actions of the war. Remaining in the Charleston area, he led a group of 50 to 60 against a corps of British woodcutters in November. After a year of harassing British troops and supply units, ambushing patrols, and making off with enemy horses, the woodcutter raid was to be his final combat experience with the Continental Army. His last military function was to scout a campsite at Ashley Hill, outside of Charleston. Regardless of Kosciuszko's feelings toward promotion, he was not only raised to the rank of brigadier general at the war's end, but received American citizenship as well. In the presentation of his new rank, Washington offered a gift of 2 pistols and a sword. In addition, Kosciuszko received the Cincinnati Order Medal, becoming a founding member of the Society of the Cincinnati. Established by officers of the Continental Army and their French counterparts, the order remains the oldest patriotic organization in the U.S. and exists to promote knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence. Back to Poland. With the American Revolution behind him, Brigadier General Kosciuszko earned a pension from the United States government in the amount of $12,000, which was not immediately paid. However, now at liberty to return to Poland, he left in the same way in which he had come, poor, jobless, and without clear prospects. Arriving in Poland in 1783, Kosciuszko encountered the same lack of opportunity with which he had contended as a returning student. His American experience held him in high stead with Polish revolutionists, but he received no officer's commission in the military due to his open espousal of freedom. The Czartoryski family, the most powerful in Poland, had in his absence reconsidered their allegiance to Poniatowski and now opposed him. As before, the response was to find available work, and Kosciuszko lived in a small country estate for the first 5 years in dire poverty. Ironically, the honors continued to accumulate in the U.S., where he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. The stress of debt was exacerbated by his freeing of the estate's serfs from their obligations of villein service. The medieval term signifies a serf with freeman status, with the exception of his lord's jurisdiction. He pays for the right to work the nobleman's land. Villein service was the most prominent distinction between peasantry and nobility in Russia and its controlled lands, of which Poland was a part. Ironically, Kosciuszko came under the personal protection of his former lover Ludwika Sosnowski, now the wife of Prince Lubomirski. The family supported liberal reform in Poland, and through covert support among like-minded houses, Kosciuszko was made a major general in the resistance. In October of 1789, another unhappy attraction developed, in which the 44-year-old general fell in love with an 18-year-old girl of noble birth. As before, winning the father's approval was impossible, though this time Kosciuszko did escape the beatings suffered in the Sosnowski scandal. Poniatowski, forever torn between liberal reform and allegiance to Empress Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg, managed to assemble a constitution in 1791 that blended Polish tradition, Russian obligations, and a hint of Enlightenment idealism. Some aristocratic houses, fearing loss of power, pleaded with Catherine to intervene and crush all talk of liberal reform. The Confederation of Targowica was formed by a collective of noble houses dedicated to overthrowing Poniatowski's modern constitution. Catherine's response was immediate. She invaded Poland in 1792 with the intent of stamping out any alteration of tradition that threatened Russian control. Kosciuszko, fighting with the resistance, rose to fame on July 18th of that year at the Battle of Dubienka, a fight infamous for its bloody nature. Shortly after, he was raised to the rank of general lieutenant by Poniatowski, still on the fence between reform and Catherine's edicts. In the same year, France offered Kosciuszko honorary French citizenship, partly out of affection for their old alliance, and in part out of suspicion that he may soon require safe haven out of Poland. To the French, this might make him more useful in domestic matters dear to Paris. Military resistance against Catherine was expressed in two theaters, one in northern Lithuania and the other in southern Ukraine. Polish armies were forced to retreat in both regions, but offered more successful resistance in Ukraine under Kosciuszko and Prince Poniatowski of the king's family. As Russian forces crossed into the Ukraine, they were met with an unexpected resistance, as both Poniatowski and Kosciuszko were stationed there. Still outnumbered, the Poles executed an offensive retreat to the southern banks of the Bug River. There they defended the last natural line of defense with 14,000 men, with a small number of heavy guns, over a period of 5 days. The Russians had amassed 18,000 men with 60 artillery pieces. In the end, anticipating inevitable defeat, the King of Poland brought about the greatest fear of the resistance and defected from the liberal cause, realigning his loyalty to Catherine. Seeking a bloodless solution, he understood the unlikely odds of compromise with Russia. Under instructions from the Empress, Poniatowski joined with the Targowica Confederation, and the resistance effort ended, despite Kosciuszko's willingness to continue. Eventually, to Poniatowski's great disappointment, his favorite engineer-general resigned his commission and followed the exodus of exiled liberals into Saxony. His final destination was Leipzig, a center of Polish migration in the following years. Poland was partitioned between Russia and Prussia in 1793, at once severing 115,000 square miles of land from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Abroad again. With a long-standing invitation from France, where he was still held in esteem, there was little reason for Kosciuszko to remain in Leipzig, leading a stagnant exile's life. By January of 1793 he was back in Paris, with excellent letters of introduction in hand, on a political mission espousing the Polish national cause. Seeking diplomatic and military help from every quarter, his promise was to establish a structure in Poland precisely mirroring that of the French government. However, France was embroiled in its own internal troubles, and Kosciuszko's unfortunate timing coincided with the execution of King Louis XVI. Such a coincidence prejudiced Europe against any independence movement in Poland, accompanied by accusations of Jacobinism. French nobility applied the term to any member of a radical society or a revolutionary group supporting the reign of terror that was to persist for a 5-year period. He tried his hand with the Girondists, members of the Jacobins but more resistant to the spiraling violence. They were eventually purged from the French National Assembly, and later suffered mass executions. Kosciuszko was armed with promises to anyone in France who would listen that radical internal reforms were to take place in Poland as a willing partner. He further guaranteed that his free homeland would assist France against Prussia and Austria, currently in a state of war with France, as they entered their own revolution. With national survival at stake, no level of government or social genre showed any interest in fighting Poland's battles. Temporarily blunted, Kosciuszko was aware that the resistance in Poland was once more on the rise, and that another uprising could come at any time. The loosely organized leadership offered Kosciuszko command of all the national armies with dictatorial power. He showed little interest in a widespread guerrilla action, a form into which he feared such an uprising might slide. However, despite his declaration that he would have nothing to do with Cossack riding, he added that if there was to be a war, it must be a regular war on the American model. In August, he returned to Saxony, with its growing liberal population of displaced Poles, to face new demands that he take charge of the uprising. Within the year, Kosciuszko returned to Poland and settled in the region of Krakow. Following one or two bouts of hesitation, he accepted leadership of the national forces against Russian occupation, secretly visiting Krakow to inspect plans, personnel, and resources. Appalled by the inadequate preparations made, he immediately placed a delay on the insurrection and went abroad again. This decision proved to be unwise. Aware of the coming tension, the enemy was given time to undermine the Polish conspiracy through a rash of widespread arrests, and by drastically reducing Polish numbers within the army. In a state of desperation, those remaining in the underground began the uprising anyway, without Kosciuszko's leadership, on March 12, 1794. The Kosciuszko Uprising. Amid the public's outcry, Kosciuszko returned to Krakow on March 24th. His entry into the city was met by an enormous crowd insisting that he speak. In response, he solemnly swore to lead an act of national uprising against the occupiers, Russia and Prussia. In return for wielding virtually all power over the resistance, he guaranteed that he would personally set up an administration, a military force, and that he would take upon himself all political responsibility. As for the philosophical underpinnings of the effort, he swore to defend the sacred rights to liberty, personal security, and property, a substitute for Jefferson's pursuit of happiness. Employing Locke for the phrase, he knew of property's importance to the parties at hand. For the lower classes that made up the bulk of the uprising, it was a priceless vision of ownership denied for centuries. Indeed, few, if any, famous names were associated with the insurrection, only small squires, traders, peasants, and men of low degree. To put off the notion that he would ally himself in any way to Jacobinism, he publicly dedicated his arms to the Capuchins, symbolically a religious sanction against Jacobinism. Kosciuszko understood well that the caliber of the enemy soldier was distinctly superior, and that he would have to counter its quality with whatever quantity he could amass. In a first step to guaranteeing numerical superiority, he introduced conscription, and enlarged existing units by incorporating new recruits. Inhibited by an utter lack of industry that could be retooled for the war effort by providing conventional arms, Kosciuszko exhorted his followers to take up ancient weapons, the pike and the scythe. He organized the masses of Poland into a scythe-raising horde, more daunting to the Russian professionals than one might suppose. In the Russian psyche, the scythe symbolized the grim reaper, and in the first conflicts, Kosciuszko found these quaint weapons surprisingly intimidating and effective. The first victory for the resistance came on April 4th of 1794. The war scythe proved its worth in the face of more modern weaponry at Rakławice under Kosciuszko's personal command. New battle tactics were unveiled, previously unseen by the Russians or Prussians. These included the practice of columns in strange new formations, attacking on the run in lieu of stately prepared marches. The running attack was supported with heavy artillery. To heighten the recruitment of new peasant warriors, Kosciuszko co-wrote and signed the Manifesto of Polaniec, at a camp near the small town of Saint-Domingue on May 7th. This document granted peasants personal freedom, provided they fulfill financial obligations to landowners and to pay state taxes. The manifesto also gave peasants a hereditary right to keep the land upon which they worked. Despite the fact that the pronouncement was never carried out after being sabotaged by the nobility and the Catholic clergy, its effect on recruitment was profound. Dreams of ownership brought in more regulars and 2,000 additional peasants. The alien concept of personal freedom and ownership had an immense moral effect on the larger peasant community. The resistance army was given food from the local monasteries, and metal possessions were melted to support the war effort. For a regular Polish soldier serving the Russians, to break away was exceedingly difficult. Kosciuszko was forced to content himself with increased peasant numbers and the valor of the Scythians. Among the civilian community, the fever for revolution caught on. In Warsaw, Poles expelled the Russian garrison, with days of street fighting under the command of General Makronowski. A provisional government was formed 5 days later, and Jakub Jasinski, a Polish general and Enlightenment poet, drove the Russians out of Wilno. Kosciuszko's force had by this time reached 14,000, including 10,000 regulars. To supplement both numbers and mobility, he created an all-Jewish cavalry unit, the first such entity since biblical times. Dov-Bair Yoselovich, financier, commanded the force. Kosher food was supplied, and members of the cavalry were permitted to abstain from combat on the Sabbath when circumstances allowed. Yoselovich referred to Kosciuszko as a messenger of God. At the Battle of Szczekocina on June 5th, Kosciuszko met the Russian and Prussian forces combined, with a force of 25,000 men. The resistance fought well, and when forced to retreat, they were able to reach Warsaw without being pursued. Kosciuszko's losses were severe, with 3 of his 6 generals slain and 2 wounded. The Prussians were victorious at Krakow on June 22nd, while in Warsaw pandemonium broke out among the public. Mobs roaming Warsaw broke into the jails and murdered the political prisoners. An appalled Kosciuszko rounded up the ringleaders for punishment, and 10,000 of the rank and file joined him. The provisional government broke into factions threatening total collapse, but Kosciuszko was able to restore a sense of temporary unity. Still reeling from recent losses, the resistance met the enemy again on July 9th, led by Frederick Wilhelm II of Prussia. Kosciuszko's outmanned army faced a force of 25,000 men with 179 guns, and a Russian general with 16,000 men and 74 guns. As if this was not overwhelming enough, Kosciuszko met a third force of 11,000, joining the enemy from the banks of the Vistula. The defense of Warsaw, despite its inevitable defeat, stands as Kosciuszko's greatest military success in Europe, and one of his greatest displays of tactical genius. For 2 months, he fended off Prussian and Russian armies of superior numbers by employing his finest aspects as a strategist and engineer. Enlisting the civilian population to build earthworks and to fight for the city alongside the soldiers, Warsaw was transformed into an array of defenses that proved vexing for any invader. In a contrarian approach, Kosciuszko led fixed-bayonet charges, and he stirred rebellion in nearby towns to create a threat behind enemy lines requiring their attention. Most prominent was a parallel uprising in Wielkopolska at the Prussian rear, forcing Frederick Wilhelm II to retreat. Unfortunately, upon the heels of the Prussian withdrawal, Russian forces reacted with such immediacy as to deny Kosciuszko the time with which to prepare for an onslaught by overwhelming numbers. From August 26th through September 1st, Kosciuszko was able to survive with a valorous force of 35,000 defenders and 200 guns within the city. On the first day, 2 assaults were repelled, and Jan Henryk Dąbrowski was able to capture a number of Russians at Bydgoszcz, causing the remainder of the enemy force to retire. However, Kosciuszko's resistance suffered a general defeat at Makiejowice, during which he was wounded and taken prisoner on the field. He had relied on the support of General Poninsky, located only 4 miles away, but reinforcements never arrived as planned. As a result, 7,000 Poles were annihilated by a force of 16,000 Russians. Some claim that when Kosciuszko fell, he cried, "Finis Polonais," but this account is largely dismissed as patriotic fantasy. With the loss of the commanding general, the uprising collapsed at once, resulting in yet another partitioning of Poland, the third and direst. Whereas previous partitions changed the level of aristocratic rule with a king of mixed allegiances, Poland was erased from the map by Catherine. Renamed the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a ward of Russia, Poland as a nation would not exist for another 123 years. As a war prisoner, Kosciuszko was not poorly treated, but his wounds did not receive careful attention, and his period of recovery was lengthy. Imprisoning Kosciuszko and his colleagues, Catherine remained an object of Polish hatred in perpetuity. Incarcerated in the Peter Paul fortress in St. Petersburg, Kosciuszko slowly recovered. The most surprising turn of events in Polish-Russian relations to that point in history occurred upon the death of Catherine in 1796, at the age of 67. Throughout her reign, as it had been during the era of her father, Peter the Great, Russia sought expansion at any cost. She fought with every powerful entity on each of her borders at one time or another to add land to her empire. When a foe was vanquished and the conquered lands annexed, the most powerful sources of resistance were at once humbled, and so it was with Poland. The Czartoryski estates were confiscated, and the Polish princes were sent to St. Petersburg as hostages to attend court in forced service. However, when Catherine's son, Paul I, assumed the throne, Russia's stance changed. Paul sought a state of harmony among the various components of the Russian Empire, and no individual from the past conflicts inspired him with respect more than Tadeusz Kosciuszko. In a dramatic display of humility, the Tsar, with his son and the Grand Duke in tow, visited the Polish prisoner in his cell as a prelude to publicly declaring him a free man. The gesture included the release of 12,000 additional Polish prisoners. Once liberated, still bearing severe injuries from the conflict, Kosciuszko was showered with a series of gifts from the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the Grand Duke. Finally, he was provided with a financial gift of 12,000 rubles with which to travel to the United States. With news of his release, various command positions from all corners of Europe were offered. However, Kosciuszko would not draw his sword on any national entity's behalf until the liberation of Poland was promised as a high priority. After much deliberation, he decided to accept Paul's gift and sail to America once more, even surrendering to an oath of allegiance to the Tsar and promising never to take up arms again. America was the obvious choice for both safety and financial recovery. Kosciuszko had friends there, whose careers had risen in stature, and he was owed money by Congress for previous service. The same year he was released, he sailed from Stockholm to London, sailing then for Philadelphia out of Bristol. The decision to revisit the United States is considered by some to be a deception, suggesting that Kosciuszko misled his enemies into thinking he would retire there. Considering the further hardening of his democratic values, it is likely that his search for solvency was a first step toward supporting the next revolution in Poland. In Kosciuszko's mind, he must have understood the time frame necessary for such a step, as the now subsumed Poland had lost half of its population in the conflict with Russia. Still, he was essentially a Democrat, in the mold of Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette, believing that a republic can only be regenerated with an insistence on absolute liberty and equality before the law. That said, two realities inhibited the realization of the dream in Poland. First, the principles of the Enlightenment were far ahead of their time on a continent steeped in aristocratic rule. Secondly, such principles signaled a transfer of power to the lower classes. This had forced Kosciuszko to accept half measures at every turn in such a rigid class society. Moreover, the aristocracy would be sure to react in the same manner. Even in America, his arrival created suspicion among the Federalists allied to John Adams. Kosciuszko's friend Jefferson was not yet president, and their behavior together would be monitored in detail by the opposition. Kosciuszko sailed into the harbor of Philadelphia on August 18, 1797, aboard the Adriana, to a hero's welcome, and immediately took residence at 3rd and Pine Streets, but shortly after his arrival he was visited by Dr. Benjamin Rush, who pleaded with him to leave at once. The region was beset by an outbreak of yellow fever, and immediate plans would have to be curtailed. Kosciuszko headed north, where he met with General Gates, Agrippa Hull, and other old acquaintances. Prospects went well in his quest for retroactive funds. Friend John Dawson of Virginia convinced Congress to pay Kosciuszko the sum he was promised following the war. The figure was calculated at $18,912, and a fairly sizable allotment of acreage in the Ohio Territory, not yet heavily settled by white settlers, was added. Alternate claims suggest that the figure offered was a pension of $15,000 with 500 acres of land in Ohio. Payment was not immediate, and Kosciuszko prepared himself for the customarily slow dealings of the United States Congress. Among the most favored visitors from that time was Little Turtle, the last chief of the Miami tribe. The Indiana-born chief had once led the greatest Indian victory over the U.S. Army in history, over none other than Arthur St. Clair. Little Turtle struck an emphatic chord in Kosciuszko as a man who would not tolerate mistreatment of others. Records exist that in such a spirit Little Turtle captured black slaves and brought them to his village, where they lived without abuse. Although he bequeathed them to his children, nothing in the written record suggests that they were treated as slaves in the European sense. Upon meeting Kosciuszko, he presented the war hero with an ornate peace pipe and tomahawk. Kosciuszko, in turn, gave Little Turtle a cloak and a pair of eyeglasses. In their conversations, he expressed outrage that the indigenous people of America had suffered so much indignity and abuse. Adding to his gift a pair of pistols, he instructed Little Turtle to use them against the first man who comes to subjugate you. Kosciuszko ended up staying in America for less than a year. Rumblings of political opportunities began to trickle in from Europe, and the balance of power was altered by Napoleon Bonaparte. Exploratory invitations from France, testing his willingness to assist Napoleon, were of interest, as the French ideology was decidedly anti-Russian, and Kosciuszko treated unfolding events in Europe as fresh possibilities. He was prepared to act upon them, provided Polish liberation was paramount on the agenda. Eventually he was unable to sit by any longer and prepared for a return to Europe in order to see what opportunities might exist. Jefferson was able to work out a secret passage for Kosciuszko's return voyage by providing him with a false passport and eliminating bureaucratic obstacles to his projected negotiations with Napoleon. The secrecy was in large part due to the relationship between Jefferson and Adams, who were estranged. Jefferson hoped to make good use of Kosciuszko's influence with the French to convince them not to make war on the U.S. In March of 1798, Kosciuszko and Jefferson worked closely on a pact of honor on his estate before his departure. Under this arrangement, Jefferson was to serve as executor, and, as a special provision, facilitate the freeing and education of all slaves associated with the estate. In April, Kosciuszko wrote to Jefferson over details to his will, and in the following month, the final version was completed with Jefferson's banker, John Barnes, and John Dawson present as witnesses, and Jefferson as official executor. Part of the will read, "I beg Mr. Jefferson that in case I should die without will or testament, he should buy out of my money so many Negroes and free them that the restart sum should be sufficient to give them education and provide for their maintenance. That is to say, each should know before the duty of a citizen in the free government, and that he must defend his country against foreign as well as internal enemies who would wish to change the Constitution for the worst, to enslave them by degrees afterwards, to have good and human heart sensible for the sufferings of others, and must be married and have 100 acres of land, with instruments, cattle for tillage, and know how to manage and govern it, as well as know how to behave to neighbors, always with kindness, and ready to help them, to themselves frugal, to their children give good education, I mean as to the heart and duty to the country, in gratitude to me, to make themselves happy as possible. T. Kosciuszko." On the same day, May 5, Kosciuszko secretly sailed to Europe. On June 28, 1778, Kosciuszko docked at Bayonne, France. Still suffering from old injuries, he limped off the gangplank, although many suggest that his appearance was a deception. In the past he had developed the appearance of frailty in order to convince enemies he was in no condition for resuming his quest for armed resistance. During Kosciuszko's first days in France, Napoleon sent messages, but they went unanswered. Kosciuszko secreted himself in the country at the estate of Peter Joseph Zeltner, the Swiss ambassador to France, not yet prepared to announce his arrival. The return to France by all outward appearances was to be a disappointment. Other Polish officers and units were fighting for Bonaparte, but Kosciuszko had never trusted him to reject the call of power. As always, he clung to his position of refusing an alliance with anyone not pursuing Polish independence. To whatever degree Paul I served as an improvement over the former Empress of Russia, his vague promise to reassemble Poland into a national framework was never fulfilled. Kosciuszko continued to travel throughout France and other European nations under various aliases, meeting with anyone representing hope for Poland. For a time he attended these meetings under the name of Buda, translated as misfortune in Polish. By March of the same year he was anxious to leave Paris for fear of running afoul of the Alien and Sedition Acts. In America, an act of Congress prompted the Secretary of the Treasury to fulfill the bargain made with Kosciuszko and paid him $12,280 plus interest for 6 years of prior service. He chose John Barnes to oversee investment of the funds. With Jefferson's advice, 30 shares of the Bank of Pennsylvania were purchased at an annual interest rate of 8%. In 1800, Jefferson was elected president, affecting Kosciuszko's relationship with important figures throughout Europe. In continued correspondence, Jefferson's friend congratulated him on the election and cautioned him to be virtuous, republican with justice, without display and ambition, be Jefferson and be my friend. Unable to find the help for which he hoped in Europe, Kosciuszko retired to private life in Berville, near Fontainebleau. For a time Napoleon continued to seek his assistance, but the French emperor was eventually able to find more agreeable supporters who had fewer demands. When Napoleon fell and was exiled, any viable force against Russia was eliminated, and Kosciuszko turned inward. In 1808 he published his Maneuvers of Horse Artillery through a New York publisher, including his description of the famous Polish uprising a quarter-century prior. Even the old wound of love was resolved when Kosciuszko at last married Ludwika, despite serving as her third husband. Little to nothing is known of the first two, and with Ludwika being the younger by far, the couple had a daughter. It was said within the Kosciuszko family that the patriarch's life was to the full romantic as the public one. The graciousness offered by Paul I toward Kosciuszko's release must have exerted a healthy influence on his son, Alexander I, who sought the ex-prisoner's assistance in 1814. A round of bargaining was begun over Poland's territories as part of the Congress of Vienna, resulting in a new Polish realm, but still under Russian rule. Alexander sought a constructive working relationship with Kosciuszko, but he could not keep up with what he considered unrealistic conditions. These included sweeping social reforms and Polish boundaries extending to the Dwina and Dnieper rivers. Understandably, at the heart of the impasse was the question of an independent state, free of all governing influences of the great empires. When these essentials were sent to Alexander, no reply came, as expected. Paul I and his son were not the expansionists of Catherine and Peter the Great, but to cede land was entirely antithetical to the Russian mind. Kosciuszko traveled to Solothurn, Switzerland, to continue his quiet, retired life, seeing no opportunity on the horizon to change Poland's condition. In the same year, an aging Thomas Jefferson sold Kosciuszko's shares in the Bank of Pennsylvania and reinvested the funds in a government subscription loan at 6% interest. The move was understandable, since American finances were sapped from the most recent war with Britain, and a hedge against a faltering economy was prudent. Jefferson sought to aid the Treasury in protecting the original investment. Kosciuszko's final years were generally disappointing. He accepted an invitation to the Congress of Vienna, where the question of Poland was to be discussed, despite the stalemate with Alexander. As before, leaders were set against the restoration of Poland, and the momentum for independence went nowhere. In his last days, Kosciuszko wrote an article on his beloved homeland for Raczynski's Sketch of Poles in Poland. Despite the loss of Poland as a national entity, the world did not forget him or his influence in several fields of study. Even in Britain, his one-time enemy, some of the light dragoon units underwent alteration of uniform fashion to more closely resemble Polish cavalry following the Battle of Waterloo. Tadeusz Kosciuszko died on October 15, 1817, at the estate in Solothurn at the age of 72. One source supports a claim that he died by falling from his horse, but that is far from a certainty. A more plausible and accepted theory is that he died of typhoid fever. Two countries shared Kosciuszko's remains. His organs were buried in Soleure, Switzerland. The rest of his remains were placed in a coffin to be picked up in several months by order of Tsar Alexander, and then to be transported to Krakow. Ironically, in the year that Kosciuszko died, the state of New York passed legislation banning slavery. Jefferson, with his presidency behind him, wrote of Kosciuszko that he was as pure a son of liberty as I have ever known. By then, Kosciuszko's investment placed in the hands of Jefferson had grown to a figure of $17,000. In the following year, the ex-president was obligated to submit the will to probate. This presented some difficulties, considering his age. He understood that litigation over the will would go on for several years. Jefferson turned to John Hartwell Cocke, longtime friend and anti-slavery advocate, who nevertheless declined the request despite his strong feelings for Kosciuszko. He found the section devoted to freeing and educating the slaves unworkable, as no institution in the standard school system would accept members of slave families. He was frank in admitting that to push the issue would hurt his standing in the community. The matter was allowed to fall dormant for another 3 years. In 1819, Kosciuszko's remains were exhumed and placed among the king's tombs in Wawel Cathedral in the city of Krakow. So passionate were the city's residents that they revived the ancient custom of constructing burial mounds. A large mound to Kosciuszko's memory was erected near the city in the tradition of King Krak and Queen Wanda, the grandest in Krakow. The Norbertine sisters granted access to the land atop Bronislawa Hill in Świecieniec, and the first mass was held there by the time construction had barely begun. Artifacts from Kosciuszko's life and soil from nearly every battlefield upon which he fought were included within the memorial. Among the peasants, people of all ages brought soil from their individual villages. The memorial was built in 4 years and was at its completion 34 meters in height and 326 meters above sea level. On the clearest days of the year, one can see the Tatar Mountains in the distance from atop the mound. On May 12, 1821, Jefferson finally submitted the Kosciuszko will to the Circuit Court of Albemarle, Virginia. Lamentably, the Poles' final wishes for the American slaves were never realized. The court in turn handed the problem to Benjamin L. Lear of Washington, D.C., naming him the duly appointed administrator. Lear suggested that to satisfy Kosciuszko's final request, the funds could be donated to the new school for slave children, planned by the African Education Society of New Jersey, but that plan was abandoned as well, due in part to Kosciuszko having signed alternate wills, leaving various amounts to several individuals. Members of the Kosciuszko family came forward with cases against Lear's initial proposal. Again, the bulk of the will sat dormant, this time for 3 decades. In the interim, the Corps of Cadets erected a monument to him at West Point, a site that all but owed its existence to the famous engineer. A Polish-American museum was opened at 308 Walnut Street in Philadelphia, including the residential property in which Kosciuszko lived, known today as Kosciuszko House. Inevitably, his will was taken up once more in 1852. The funds within the account had doubled in 30 years' time, and the case found its way to the U.S. Supreme Court as John F. Innes versus J.H.B. Smith. Innes represented the various family members and their descendants. During the hearing of the case, Kosciuszko's intended support of the slaves was relegated to the status of a myth, and others reaped the funds. Kosciuszko's name can be found all over America and Europe today. A monument to his memory was constructed in Washington, D.C. in 1910, and in 1925 the Polish Air Force established the Kosciuszko Squadron, which was specifically tasked with fighting the Russians. In the same year, the Kosciuszko Foundation was founded in the U.S. for the purpose of educational and cultural exchange between the United States and Poland. The Penny Bridge over Newton Creek in New York was replaced and rebuilt from Maspeth, Queens to Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Dubbed the Kosciuszko Bridge, it featured a panoramic view of Manhattan, and it was adorned with all manner of symbols that unite Poland and the U.S. In 1943, the 1st Infantry Division of the Polish Army was named for Kosciuszko, despite the fact that the unit served within the Soviet Union and answered to the Central Russian state. In other military associations, the ORP General Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the former USS Wadsworth, joined the Polish Navy as a guided missile frigate. Artists across Europe and America dedicated works to Kosciuszko. Reinhold Sucholdolski, a noted Polish writer, dedicated a song to Kosciuszko before dying in battle in 1831. The text portrayed the hero as looking down from heaven. Thomas Campbell, the Scottish poet, set up a literary association in support of Polish independence, and Lord Byron's tribute to Kosciuszko declared that the famous Pole embodied the sound that crashes in the tyrant's ear. Independence National Park borders the Philadelphia property on 3rd Street, and similar avenues bear his name in the city of Vilnius, well known to the immigrant Polish population in America. Communities adopting the name can also be found in Mississippi and Indiana. Kosciuszko is a well-known landmark in Alaska, and few seem certain of the reason, but the highest mountain in Australia is also named for the Polish hero. In Fall River, Massachusetts, a wreath-laying in tribute to Kosciuszko takes place on the first Sunday of every May. The tradition has endured for over 30 years, including a ceremony in which both Polish and English are spoken. In that spirit, patriotic songs from both countries abound, and both flags are saluted. In 2017, a conservative radio host suggested renaming Virginia's Jefferson Davis Highway after Kosciuszko. In the same year, all of Poland celebrated what was termed the Year of Kosciuszko, with an outpouring of newly published books and dramas. At the Chicago Concert Hall, concert programmers went so far as to feature Kosciuszko's music in concerts. The U.S. and Poland have jointly released a new video on Polish history through the lens of Kosciuszko's life and career, and the first African-American school ever built in the United States is named for him. Even as the events of the American Revolution and the Polish Revolt of 1794 have slipped further away in time, the name of Tadeusz Kosciuszko has remained surprisingly current. Students of American history mark the brilliant achievements in engineering that saved several of the most essential military sites in the nation and rescued a large number from among its military manpower. Poles remember him as a hero of dual nationality who represents Polish pride in both hemispheres. Although his life was in many ways a series of frustrations, devotion to Kosciuszko's memory goes past military adventures and engineering principles. He is still revered for a sympathetic understanding and generosity extended to all nationalities, races, and social classes. His deeply rooted idealism espouses the individual's personal right to all the rewards available in the civilized societies of any continent.
This has been Tadeusz Kosciuszko and Casimir Pulaski, The Lives of the Revolutionary War's Most Famous Polish Officers. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Ken Tuch. Copyright 2018 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright 2018 by Charles River Editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.